Welcome, Wargamers, to the war-torn codpieces of the Mortal Realms as we continue to follow our intrepid twin-tailed crusade through the realms of Aqshy and Guaran. This is Book 3 of the Dawnbringers campaign series and Video 1 of coverage of that book, The Long Hunt. For any of this to make sense, you're going to want to catch up on the previous entries in this series. It has a lot of context about the missions and the locations of where all these things are headed. There's a link to that playlist in my description down below for you. So when you're all caught up, I will be here. In short, we left our crusades in some pretty desperate straits. In Aqshy, Trug the Trog King used the power of his migraine to destroy a city and 2 cog forts. Our heroes barely escaping through a narrow network of tunnels. And over in Guaran, our crusade was harassed by Maggotkin and some orcs, ending with their destination, Fort Gardus, getting obliterated in front of them by a horde of mega-gargants and orcs. Both sides are still moving and have the bare essentials to found the cities that they're meant to, but with every one of these scraps or battles or just people losing their minds, these crusades that were once of this unbelievable scale are getting slimmed down in piecemeal. I, for one, am really enjoying this series, and I hope you are too. So this book is somewhat written like the last ones in terms of format. There's a section that kind of gives you a preamble and sets the scene for both crusades. Notable things going on in the meta-narrative, so to speak. And then it breaks into following the stories of each side of the crusade individually. It does all the Aqshy stuff and then goes to Guaran and does that entire story front to end. And I like this because it keeps the flow of information minimal, like there's no exposition vomit really in the beginning. And this one is very minimal by comparison. Really, the overarching, idea that they wanted to pose for both crusades is this idea of dissent. Not within the Crusades themselves, but actually back in Hammerhall, Gyra and Aqshy respectively. Those city councils are having to have really tough decisions and discussions about, did we do the right thing? Did we send out there? How much more support do we send them? Did they leave us for dead because they took all the reinforcements and the guns and everything? Vedra is back at Hammerhall. She's readying a defense against a Khorne force that was spotted headed towards them. But politically, the city is a disaster. In Aqshy, the religious zeal has really taken over. The church, much like Pontifex Zenestra did in the last book, is making a lot of power plays. Basically, we don't need literal authority. If we get all the people on our side, we have all the power and authority we need. And they point out that at first, zeal was good. It boosted morale, drove recruitment, but it also became very uncontrollable. People started claiming their neighbors are heretics just to destroy them. There was a plague in the first book here, and we learn that these folks were walking around and just setting sick people on fire. But alive. And it's really starting to butt heads with order and logic as zeal and fervor are become the more violent expressions of faith. Over in Hammerhall Gyra, the realm of life, things are also bad, but in a very different way. Rather than zeal pushing them towards, or I should say forward into more violence like in Aqshy, the city leaders here are outraged at the losses these crusades are suffering, and they basically ask the question, is it humane to let them continue? It's just a really tough moral dilemma. The 2 next strongest outposts from Hammerhall on either side just got walked over by 2 completely separate armies that couldn't muster 8 brain cells if they joined forces, right? The Trog Herd army and the Sons of Behemat army in each realm respectively. And so a lot of these people wanted to recall the crusade, but that's not really an option. At this point, they're so far out there that the losses in either direction means they might as well just keep going. Not to mention there's not a whole lot for them when they come back because Hammerhall Gyra has its own issues because they're getting all kinds of weird reports about Rotigus the Rainfather in the area. He's part of this ongoing fight in the background between Nurgle and Alariel. But also there's a spat of disappearances reported by traders trickling in. No details, just a volume is noticed of towns being deserted, people just disappearing. The point is, nobody's happy. The people who sent the crusade, the people on the crusade, and yet we persist. And also a small note that's in the sidebar for something coming up later in the series. It's like a little side story, just kind of goes off to the panel on the right, where we see Kragnos talking to Gobsprack in Gur. That's Kragnos, the god of the Death faction, sort of, and Gobsprack is a named character from the Cruel Boys that basically acts as his interpreter. And the two of them are pounding on a rock wall in Gur, talking about how there is something hidden within it. They're bickering back and forth, and then Kragnos hits the wall hard enough that water begins gushing out of it. We'll come back to that point later on. So because there's so little info concerning what's going on both sides of the Crusade, I'm going to skip the preamble video that I normally do that sets the tone, and we're going to jump directly into the Aqshy Crusade. And the narrative picks up like moments after it ended in the last book, which was my favorite. Don't waste my time. Let's just jump right in. Pontifex Zenestra is leading the Aqshy Crusade through a system of tunnels, the entrance to which collapsed and kept Trug away. And while Trug hasn't been around, his army has. Just as we talked about, kind of feared at the end of the last book, the Gloomspite Gits surrounding Trug descended into these caves through like other known networks, and are causing chaos to the rearguard of the Crusade. A lot of these Dawnbringers are humans who aren't necessarily soldiers. Because remember, a lot of those soldiers die. They died in the pre-battle, and then they died at truce break, and then they died again at the rearguard. So like your pool of actual trained soldiers is getting smaller and smaller. They have nothing but faith in Sigmar and whatever wheel they've ripped off the nearest wagon. As reports are coming up to Zenestra about attacks from behind, she's also getting weird reports from scouts up ahead of some weird monsters. They are Dracoths, like, they have that kind of form of a Dracoth, but they're wreathed in like a white flame. And all of the Duarden who are on this crusade are like, immediately they know exactly what's going on, and they're like, we need to run directly at them. Which was fun, right? Everyone's like, what are you talking about? Like, we're stuck between a goblin and a fire dragon. Run to the fire dragon! But they understand what is being reported. Magmadroths. They stumbled into a den of Magmadroths, which means there's likely some Fireslayer outpost nearby, because they frequently monitor, harvest, and raise Magmadroths. Sure enough, as they get closer, it's not just, random monsters meandering the tunnels. It's a whole lodge of Fireslayers there. The Crusade leads the Gloomspite Gits up the chasm, and basically the two sides of which are lined with the Volstarg and Lofnir lodges. Two lodges that have had several of their satellite cities, or I should say their kind of minor holds, destroyed by this very horde. Remember, in the first two books of this campaign series, it featured Fireslayers whose homes were destroyed. Well, this is their faction's answer to that. Of course they were going to go to the cities of Sigmar, but there's no way they were just not going to go to other Fireslayers. And hopping down from his Magmadroth steed, none other than Big Daddy Bael Grimnir himself shows up. Now, for those of you who don't know who this is, Bael Grimnir is a character that was really introduced to us first in the Realmgate Wars, actually one of the first non-chaos factions that was met when the Stormcast re-entered the realms. They met Sylvaneth and Fireslayers first, really, and then Seraphon and Flesheater Court somewhere in that region as well. Now, his name, Bael Grimnir, if you don't know, the Fireslayer tradition is once you become, like, the Lord of the Lodge, you take on the surname Grimnir. That is to say, you lose claim to your own home, your own title, whatever like that. You are now the sole property and leader of the Fireslayers of this lodge. So his name is Bael, B-A-E-L, but his title is Bael Grimnir. The Fireslayers caught wind of this army heading towards them, and so they set up a trap, and then when a bunch of humans came into the trap, they were like, I don't feel good about this, and then the goblins came after them, and they're like, okay, now we're on board, and sprang out. Once the fighting is done and the Gloomspite are pushed back, Zenestra opens the coffers of the entire crusade and basically hires a colossal Fireslayer army on the spot, which I just love. I mean, the church is just like, we don't need any of this money. Kick open all the coffers, and all the dwarves are like, I'm in. Now, there's still not as many people in the crusade as when they first left the city, but the ratio of sad peasant farmers to veteran warriors has shifted significantly. And the Fireslayer force is made up of a great deal of Doomseekers, so survivors of those fallen holds. They ran to let the other lodges know what's going on. They took on the oath of a Doomseeker and wanted to come back. And to me, quite frankly, as I was reading this, I was like, oh good, so the fighting won't be boring, because their little pandemonium in the caverns, it got to be a little bit pointless when all these newbie churchgoers are just trying to die hard enough to buy time. That's all it was for a little while. But in addition to some awesome fight scenes, Braille Grimnir brings some knowledge. He knows the area well, so when the Crusade explains this is where we're headed, they offer him the money, and basically the proposition goes like this. We lost a bunch of stuff too. Why don't you help us get set up as part of your vengeance, right? Undoing the terrible things that these armies have done to you. And then when we get set up, we'll re-equip you, we'll resupply you, and keep your fury train moving. If you can deliver us safely to our destination. Get us there, we'll restock, resupply, and we'll send you right back out. And the Fireslayers are like, yes, but I said Bale has knowledge because they have an alternate route that actually ends up being very significant to this story. Because the Fireslayers reported seeing a large, inconceivably large Khorne army headed towards Hammerhall in Akshi. Which we knew, right? They've mentioned that for a couple books now. And they want to stick to the caves and go underneath this army and then pop out at a little area near a sea, head north along it. It's a slightly longer route than that they were going to do, but it does avoid as much danger as possible. Basically, we'll go underneath the majority of the army, maybe have some skirmishers on the outside, but it'll drop us off on the end and we'll cut across. And it sounded great until they realized the sea that was mentioned to them is not just a sea, it is the Heartblood Sea. Think the Mediterranean Ocean, but full of blood, right? Same viscosity, color, smell of metals, it's bubbling, it's gross. They come out of the caverns, that's the first thing you see. That's a little bit disheartening. And remember, during this next little bit, they're still being harassed here and there by Gloomspite Gits. They've infested the tunnels behind them. They're just constantly probing and following and scouting and trying to learn more. Well, when the Crusade comes out onto this, beach, I should say, of the ocean, they're immediately spotted by a bunch of Blood Reavers on the crest above them. This is some tiny arm of the Khorne army that they were hoping to avoid. They call out and a battle seems to be drawing up. Right as some of those initial fighters begin meeting one another, thunder erupts and lightning hits the ground, where Liberators form up into rank and file. In fact, a whole ton of Stormcast Eternals lightning arc down the minute the Crusade is basically visible by the sky again. My assumption is Sigmar just had no idea where these people were for a little bit. I have no way to confirm that, but the minute they pop their heads out and there's danger, all of a sudden there's reinforcements. Among their number, again, it's a whole contingent coming down, which must have scared the ever-loving crap out of all these humans, are a few characters that made me so stoked. First of all, Neeve Blacktalon and her motley crew. If you have not watched the Neeve Blacktalon animated series on Warhammer Plus, I'm going to be doing a review of it. But basically, it's her as a named character and then a coterie of other hunters and experts that she's brought together, and they act as a warband. So there's her and her people, but there's also my boy, Vandus Hammerhand. Both epic heroes of the Hammers of Sigmar Chamber, or Stormhost I should say, and some very, very interesting things take place. First of all, like you would expect, they beat the Khorne bloodbound away very easily, right? This was a skirmish party, kind of like a scouting arm of the bigger Khorne force versus a whole contingent of Stormcast. Nah. Pontifex Zenestra walks up to Vandus and says, just basically heralds him as a hero. We know about your legend. You're so famous. You're a god amongst the people. Will you lead us triumphantly to found the next cornerstone of Sigmar's, epic defense or whatever? And Vandus is like, nah. Which might be the biggest, wet fart response in all of Warhammer history. But he says no, and we learned some very interesting things. I'm going to tackle them more in the next video where we really go into detail about Vandus's appearance here. But he has his own mission, his own struggles, and we're going to dive into that. But essentially, this argument between the three of them erupts. People are ticked. They're like, well, Vandus is supposed to be the hero. Why doesn't he want to help us? What could be so much bigger than that? Arguments, grumbling, all this kind of stuff. The Fire Slayers are like, they hired us, but Why are we getting hired to defend them if you won't even defend your own people? You know, all these kind of arguments that make perfect sense. And at some point, Neeve Black Talon steps in and says, everybody shut up. Here's the plan. Me and my Black Talons and a few veterans, we're going to go with the Crusade to get them to their destination. Vanus is going to go do his own thing, which we'll cover in the next video. At which point, when Black Talon gets there, she will have fulfilled her oath. She will leave and rejoin Vanus, and the cities and the Fire Slayers will stay there, and they'll finish out their contract. And this is where our Akshi Crusade part of the book diverts into two really well-defined sections. There's the continued Crusade, which now we have Cities of Sigmar, Fire Slayers, and just a few Stormcast Eternals. Neeve's useful because she's a scout, she knows the area very well. And the other arm is Vandus' army, moving south to engage and distract that colossal Khorne horde in the area. And so I wanted to pause here and discuss what we've learned so far. Kind of molding this into my why is this cool section. First of all, I love the fact that no time was lost. Like, immediately jump back into the story. They have reasons for adding reinforcements. I like the fact that not only was there a City of Sigmar response to whatever crisis happened to these lodges, but of course a Fire Slayer one, because of course there would be, and of course they would be walking around the caves where all these things were happening. I liked it because they had a reason to be there. Like, it's not fun to me if there's a total non sequitur. They make perfect sense. The minute the Crusade comes out and the Stormcast join them, I mean, they're in the Great Parch. They're in Corgus's home. If Vandus is looking for them, this is the place to be. It makes absolute sense again. But this story went from, you know, kind of taking away elements of like the Cities of Sigmar free guild units kind of being wiped out largely, and then adding a whole bunch of more fun, engaging things. Stormcast, the Fire Slayers, new enemies in the Gloomspite gets focus rather than the Trogs, and of course Khorne. But even just plot threads. Bael Grimnir and his lodges are being destroyed. Vandus is here hunting Corus Cole, which we'll talk about more tomorrow. Neeve is an assassin, which means that if she's here, someone's got a mark on their head, which is a cool idea. And it's just nice when it's not a stretch. That said, this is some serious Realm Gate Wars nostalgia bait for me, and I have wanted to see these characters again for years. Like, the story with Vandus and Corus Cole really just ended. Like, there wasn't even a good resolution. Corgus was denied becoming a demon prince, but like, I don't know, it just kind of tapered off. I want to see the consequences of this. What has this feud been looking like over centuries? Morale is beginning to fray, and at a certain point, no amount of faith can stop that. But as allies keep coming to the rescue, the momentum kind of grows and dissipates both in equal measure. All that to say, I'm very excited to see where the Akshi Crusade goes now that we have some named characters and some notable personalities on board. Friends, I would love to hear your thoughts on this in my next video. Because these sections are not terribly big, I decided to go ahead and just put the resolutions to both in the next video. So we're going to cover Vandus' story to the south and also the Crusade story to the north. For me personally, this is the kind of army that I like. Just a lot of different desperate forces of order coming together, put into weird, impossible situations, and there's just a lot going on in the balance. It's a lot of fun. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it down below. Let me know how you feel about Vandus reappearing, Bael Grimnir, Neeve, and company. Also, if any of you have had any deep thoughts about Pontifex Zenestra now that the battle tome's out, I would love to hear about those as well. Leave your comments down below and I will chat with you next time. Happy wargaming, friends. Welcome, Wargamers, to the Throwback Thursdays of the Mortal Realms, because today we are hopping in that way back machine, and we're hanging out with some good old friends from Age of Sigmar 1st Edition. This is Book 3 of the Dawnbringers campaign series known as The Long Hunt, and Video 2 of its coverage. Now, for any of this to make sense, you're going to want to catch up on the previous entries to have a lot of context about the missions, the characters, and so on. There's a link to the description, in the description to this playlist. Go watch those and get caught up. Now, as I mentioned in our last video, we left our story in Akshi and we're picking it right back up because our Crusade here got a bit of a resupply. We met up some Fire Slayers led by Bael Grimnir, some refugees of Trug's Rampage, then the Stormcast Eternals descended led by Vandus Hammerhand, who is an epic hero from Age of Sigmar Season 1. There are going to be some crazy curveballs thrown this way, so I think you're really going to enjoy this story. The way they bring older characters in with newer elements and factions, I thought was really, really cool. So getting back to our reinforced crusade over in Aqshy, they've come to a bit of an understanding after butting heads quite a bit. Vanus is not interested in helping this crusade at all. He basically was like, oh, I'm already going there and these guys need some assistance, so I might as well drop down there, help them out, but he had no plans to follow them long term. Instead, this entire time he has been hunting Corus Cole, the leader of the Blood Tide, one of the largest Khorne warbands to ever exist. And this scene is really important as I hope and think it's going to prelude to what we see in the next book. I have no specifics, but like specifically for the Aqshy Crusade. Because Vanus is revered as this epic hero of righteousness. And here he is, to a parade of thousands of crusaders actively neglecting to aid them, which has an awful effect on morale. Also, pretty sour experience for an entire city to have before founding the new outpost that is going to be needed to be secured by Stormcast Eternals. A bit of a bummer. How many other cities would have, castles built in honor of Vanus, and these guys are going to be like, heck with that guy. Regardless, in the end, Neeve Blacktalon had the plan. She and a few of Vanus's guard are going to accompany the crusade. Just as an escort to the destination, she knows some shortcuts. While Vanus takes the fight south to draw the attention of the Khorne forces away from the crusade. That way, everybody gets what they want. You go pick a fight with Khorne fighters, we'll go north, you just make sure it's loud so it's a distraction. So he does just that, he heads south. And so we're going to tackle these two stories in this episode, but understand that they are happening concurrently. We start with our Age of Sigmar battle report that we got with the initial box that released with this game. You will see what I mean. So Vanus Hammerhand is headed south when scouts report that they have reinforcements inbound. Vanus is like, what are you talking about? I didn't ask for any reinforcements. So he looks up, he's all curious. They see in the sky a full Dracolith wing coming at them in a V formation. He's like, okay, not sure what this is about. And at their fore is an old friend, Ionus Cryptborn on his mount, Cathorak. Now I'm going to have a dedicated video about Ionus later, I promise you. But this is the original Lord Relictor that came in the core box. And now he's got a sweet ride ever since we unlocked the Dracolith chamber. He hops off his mount and the two embrace as friends. And this next bit is really what made my eyebrow raise up. It's kind of hard without reading the dialogue to give you an exchange, but they have the most interesting conversation. Ionus basically says, "What are you doing, Vanus? You know you do not have orders to personally hunt Corus Cole." To which Vanus replies, well, I have orders to go out and, hunt Khorne bros and protect, the regions owned by the God King. And hey, if I happen to find Corus Cole, and it becomes clear through this discussion that this character, Corus Cole, has become an eternal obsession of Vanus's. And not only is it just a normal fixation, but as he gets reforged, it gets more and more intense. Vanus is changing. Now, when we first met this character, Vanus Hammerhand, he used to have these somewhat minor premonitions, just kind of flashes of things that might be. He was kind of held at an arm's distance by some because some people were not sure if it's an innate ability, if he's a wizard at heart, or if there's something wrong with the reforging process, whatever it is. Well, now it's not flashes. This dude goes into full-on gnosis with nightmares. In all of them, there is a dark figure coming for him, intermingled with visions from his mortal life of getting killed by Kull's tribe. And it's just very strange. So we have a lot to catch up on with him. Hopefully there is a book about it coming soon. I think that kind of long war perspective would be really neat for these heroes. But snapping back to our conversation, it devolves between Ionus and Vanus into a full-blown argument. Ionus is like, bro, you have orders, and Vanus is like, I'm gonna find a way to follow my orders and get what I want. In this case, revenge. But it gives us great insight into really these characters and how they've developed over this time. Vanus is deteriorating. He's becoming more callous to people asking him for help. He was supposed to defend the mortals, or at least in their mind he was supposed to do that. And he keeps trying to railroad his own agenda into Sigmar's plans. Basically, how can I make this about Corus Cole? Meanwhile, Ionus, he got a promotion. In fact, he got a new car. He got the company car. The Dracolith. That's the best. I don't know if you heard. Those things are pretty good. And it clearly states that because he is operating, he being Ionus, is operating on the direct orders of Sigmar rather than shoehorning anything in like Vanus, that Ionus is no longer outranked by him. And this means that Sigmar has given Ionus a mission that he is not going to foil with his personal vendettas like Vanus is doing. Now, this is a fantastic conversation. Unfortunately, it was interrupted as they come upon another arm of this massive Khorne warband. And this battle is super cool. Like I joked about it earlier, it really is Age of Sigmar 1.0, that core starter set, with modern Age of Sigmar storytelling, which is rad. At the front of this horde is Vek the Slayer, Bloodstoker of Khorne, renowned thick boy of whip adage. And Vanus is so amazed to see this guy because, if you remember back to that starter set, this is one of Cole's top guys. So Vanus is like, I have to be getting close. This is like one of his top guys. He was in the starter set with me. And as Vanus is kind of hacking and cleaving at Vek, he gets absolutely clotheslined by a Korgorath, which is just awesome. And then the whole thing just kind of devolves. You have Vanus and Vek punching each other, and then you have the Dracolith that he rides fighting with the Korgorath. It's a really cool scene. Eventually it ends with Vanus just absolutely crushing this dude's skull. And as he strikes down Vek, instead of feeling this like ecstasy of like, oh, I finally did it, I made an achievement or progress towards hunting Kull, he begins to kind of feel like his legs are on fire. And he kind of pans around in a rather cool scene, noticing that all the Stormcast Eternals with him are feeling very much the same way. Everyone's kind of struggling to fight because they're all looking downward. And this is when the lake of blood that everyone is next to begins to boil aggressively and starts to churn. Blood drops start moving upward like reverse rain. And for those of you who are fans from back in the day, you know what this means. Threx Skullbrand, Corus Cole's personal blood secretor, the OG one from the box set, slams his icon into the earth, channeling all this blood and murder. And this is a really cool thing. Like one of the first captivating scenes from Age of Sigmar that I personally enjoyed was when the blood secretor was planted. Lore-wise, when they plant that, it's like a rift opens between Khorne's realm and wherever this banner is. It empowers Khorne forces, it hurts enemies, and in this story, allows a bloodthirster to erupt from that ocean of blood. Now, I know what you were thinking. Whoa, this is a direct subordinate of the greatest Khorne character ever, Corus Cole, at least in Age of Sigmar, right? Along with a greater demon, a bloodthirsty, surely this is going to be one heck of a fight. However, not even the greatest of Khorne's champions could best the power that comes with having a new model, because Ionus and Cathorak take out these champions pretty aggressively. Vanus had Vek and the Korgorath. Ionus takes out... first he starts with Ionus dropping to the ground for a ground fight between the Blood Secretor and he. And so basically, Ionus takes his mace, puts it straight into the Blood Secretor's skull, and he basically just turns into pudding. And as the Bloodthirster is like initially getting his big, gusts of wind from his wings rising from the Blood Lake, Cathorak is just kind of kiting him and showering him in fire to the point where he collapses right back down into the lake. It just got shut down so stinking quick. And if it seems like that was very brief, it's because it was. It was kind of eyebrow raising for me to be like, that was just kind of an interrupting the conversation fight scene, not as epic as the characters and units involved would make you think. But with this battle over, the conversation kind of resumes. Ionus shows a writ from Sigmar himself, and basically it orders Ionus to take whatever he wants from Vanus to go achieve a mission that is not specified. There's absolutely no details for us or Vanus. All we know is Ionus is taking a ton of stuff from his best friend's army, and the two part ways. Lots to mull over in that one. I like the discussions quite a bit, but we're going to then pivot to following the Crusade because they also have a somewhat oddly brief conclusion here, but it is also an interesting point. So while all of that's happening with Vanus and Ionus, let's refocus the camera over at the Crusade of Fire, headed north towards the sweltering Gulf. Along their way, they run into this just section of land that has an impenetrable fog. And at this point, the Crusaders are getting super nervous. They're having trouble moving and breathing. The air is thick and humid, and it becomes clear after several hours of this gloom that many of their scouts are disappearing, just getting snatched up into the mists. And remember, Neeve Blacktalon and her party are moving along with the Crusade, and I'm going to do a deeper Blacktalon lore video regarding her crew. I did one directly on her, but now that she has an entourage, we have to talk about them. But to keep it brief, one of her companions is an Idoneth deepkin wizard named Lore. And Lore knows what's up. She's like, oh, the air's getting salty, we're having trouble moving. This is how deepkin fight. And it's right as they are discussing this that raiders of Futhon descend in earnest into the Crusade in lightning hit-and-run attacks. And everyone's very perplexed, because it's like, first of all, there is a non-aggression pact with the Deepkin. So, like, they shouldn't be attacking us. There was a brief moment where it's like, maybe they're attacking an enemy nearby, and we're kind of, like, caught in the periphery of their ether sea. And then immediately it's like, no, bro, you're the target. And it turns into one of the coolest fight scenes ever, because the Fire Slayers are like... Bro, we were just in a 2-player box set with the Deepkin. We know exactly how to deal with this. And so the Bale Grimnir has all of the magma droths and all the magma pike holders just basically point in every direction and douse everything in fire. It burns away the mists and it keeps them from the enemy a little bit. Kind of puts a little barrier, flame wall between you and them. Pontifex Zenestra summons a storm to do the exact same thing. Start parting some of the mist so they can actually see their enemies. There's a sweet moment where a Leviathan comes in and Neeve ducks underneath it and basically rips her axe up into its gut and pulls it across the entire length of its body, gutting it. A bunch of cities of Sigmar and Idoneth Deepkin units are killed, their souls getting ripped from their bodies and taken over by Deepkin leadership. I don't know, it's just a whole bunch of cool stuff. Until finally, the leader of this Deepkin force is basically knocked off of his mount, brought down, and captured. This is King Molpir of the Futhon Enclave. And once he's captured, the fight kind of settles. Because the Deepkin are like, not sure what to do now that their leader is technically captured by an ally, but not really. You know what I mean? Everyone chills out. And the leaders of the Crusade are kind of struggling on what to do with him. This just seems like wanton, completely random, unnecessary aggression towards an ally. Zenestra wants him dead. Like straight up, they broke the non-aggression pact, you attacked us, I want to attack you back. Lorai, the companion with Neeve, is fascinated because... she also agrees that they broke the non-aggression pact, but understands Deepkin enough to know that was not a small decision. They're not backstabbers. Something has to be horribly wrong for them to do this. To make open war against every army except their own being a better alternative to whatever drove them there, that's crazy. Which I also think might be hints to what's going on elsewhere. No specifics on that, but like it just seems very heavy-handed that there's something going on with the Deepkin to make them do this thing. And after some good back and forth, they come to a conclusion. King Molpir will atone for the sins of his enclave by facing Neeve Blacktalon in a duel of honor. Whoever wins gets to command the Idoneth Deepkin that are with him. So if Molpir wins, he gets to take his enclave and they'll leave and they'll go hunt someone else because they were bested. But if Neeve wins, the Deepkin stay with them. And while this fight is cool, if you have read any of the Black Talon books, you understand that Neeve is a blender woman. She is just... if you duct tape knives to one of those like inflatable wacky waving arm things, that is Neeve Blacktalon. She just YOLO'd a Leviathan and she takes him out pretty quickly, I won't lie, and basically secures leadership over these Deepkin forces. And that realistically is where the scene kind of fades to black, which I thought was an odd place to end it, but let's break into why is this cool. We have our two kind of sub-resolutions to the Akshi Crusade. First of all, the nostalgia bait worked. I had a great time. As someone who loved those early books and even the game before it had points, I was just like having the best time ever reading this stuff. The battles in this, I think, were better than in the previous book because we're really seeing the cracks come apart for our forces of order. Ionus and Vanus were best friends, and their paths are diverging. Ionus got a promotion of sorts, while Vanus is kind of coming apart at the seams. This is now the second book that's mentioned a large looming Khorne army, and it does make me wonder if the next edition box set's going to be a totally sexy revamp of the original one that came out, kind of like how they redid Ultramarines and Tyranids or whatever for 40k. But they really do seem to be setting up this confrontation between Corus Cole and Vanus, and I'm here for that. Those are two fantastic characters. And I'll say it here, Games Workshop, if you want me to start a Khorne army, give me an Abaddon the Despoiler styled model from 40k, but for Corus Cole. That's all it takes, because I'll dedicate this whole dang channel to the Khorne, and I'll take all of you with me. But I did like what they did with Vanus and Ionus. I thought that touching on that relationship before whatever this next leg is, I think was really cool. Obviously, Ionus has a sick-looking model, and I'm so glad he's back in the story. But to kind of counterpose that, where all the nostalgia made perfect sense and stuff like that, as I bragged about, the Idoneth deepkin stuff was super random. And while I mentioned before I don't really like things when they come out of complete left field like the deepkin army in Akshi is, I will say this fight was sweet because not only is the action fodder awesome, but the dialogue between the characters is actually very compelling. We have the Pontifex, Lore, Neeve, King Molfir, like all of these characters have their own values and they're trying to reconcile their different interpretations of the word justice. And ultimately I think that they reached the best solution. No more deepkin had to die because of King Molfir's decision. That's perfectly fair. Now, instead of just being killed or returning to their home empty-handed, shattered, and leaderless, Neeve is going to use them as the vanguard of their force. And that is pretty sick, because basically the deepkin are up front to partially let them act as a meat shield for all that they did. You can get paid back by being the first ones to die before any of us. Which, like, okay, that's rough, but fair. But also, it means that they can use the concealment that they have for the deepkin, the ether seal, all kind of stuff, for the Crusade to some extent. Maybe it won't completely, render them invisible by all other standards, but even if it just kind of obscures how many people are in the Crusade, you could probably get them to be overlooked very easily. But also because they are the vanguard, they're the first into any fights, which means they're collecting all the souls that this Crusade is now running into. Anything pops up in front, kill them, you take the souls, and hey, in the best case scenario, this ends up being a win-win. You help us get to where we're going, we send you back to your enclave with a bunch of souls, minus one treacherous king. And I dig that, but at the same time, we've seen this non-aggression pact get violated a few times now, notably with Morathi claiming the city of Anvilgard, and that didn't have much in the way of consequences, so I'm kind of hoping one day some of these will. But friends, that is it for me. I would love to know your thoughts on this. So this is the entirety of the Akshi Crusade. They came out of the tunnel, reunited with a bunch of heroes, got some allies, and then split into a military campaign with Vanus, and then also the continuing crusade with the Pontifex. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Honestly, not a lot of progress was made in this section. I was a little bit perplexed by that, but it seems like they're priming to arrive at their final destination. So I don't know if there's going to be one or two more books. I don't actually know, but I'm pretty stoked for them. So let me know your thoughts, how you think this is going to pan out, and how you felt about these fights. Leave in the comments down below and I will chat with you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the hangry vistas of the mortal realms, because today we are talking about the Guaranite arm of the Twin-Tailed Crusade in our ongoing coverage of Book 3 in the Dawnbringers campaign series known as The Long Hunt. This is video 3 of that coverage of that specific book, and I apologize for the short delay between videos. I had some family stuff to deal with, but we're back at it, and we're picking right up with the events going on in the Realm of Life. Now, for any of this to make sense, you'll want to catch up with our previous entries. It has a lot of context about the missions, the locations they're headed to, and I have a playlist to all of that in the description down below. In the last video, we wrapped up this book's coverage of the Akshi side of the Crusade, and the camera immediately pivots over to Guaran. Now, you'll remember, because this is now a few episodes back in our sequencing here, the Guaran Crusade had fended off some Nurgle forces and a bunch of Ironjaws, with their final destination of their first kind of leg of their journey being Fort Gardas, which happened to be in the crosshairs of a colossal destruction undivided war of sorts, right? It's led by King Broad of the Sons of Behemat, who has a bunch of Mega Gargants with him, but there's also Ironjaws and ogres just randomly all at their feet, because it just kind of attracts this frenzy of destruction factions. Gardas sacrifices himself in the defense of his own fort, but eventually the entire fortification itself, along with the storm keep of the Hallowed Knights built into it, does fall. And that has these defenders buying just enough time for the Guaran Crusade to flee away with some of the refugees from Fort Gardas. Basically, they stood on the outside, watched it being destroyed, took whatever survivors they could, and kept on moving. In the woods, they met up with some Sylvaneth. Turns out to be Drycha, who's actively killing them. Then a representative of Oakenbrow pops in and reminds her of the truce, the pact that has been made against the Order factions to not murder each other. And so we left off with Sylvaneth allies aiding the cause of the Guaranite force. And this story picks up immediately after that beat. So at this point, the Guaran Crusade is very much desperately heading north. They're kind of falling apart. They're shedding any loose weight that they can, and so what started as this Grand Crusade full of provisions for like 3 seasons is really winnowing down as they're trying to sacrifice, I guess, preparedness for speed. The Sylvaneth are guiding them around the woods at a quickened pace, because the Sylvaneth, if you don't know, they have these like realm routes, kind of just pathways that only they know, that they can get from place A to point B in a much quicker time than other factions can, especially in Guaran itself. I get the sense, because she kind of faded away from the story, but I get the sense that they just like told Drycha, go up ahead, right? Just go act as the vanguard, don't be anywhere near these people, just go kill something and go away, which kind of seems to be how the entire faction treats Drycha, which I'm actually here for. I love it. But just as the Axii side revisits some important locales in the Mortal Realms, we talked about that with the Age of Sigmar 1st Edition Battle Report, we have a few throwbacks in Guaran as well, because the Rumgate Wars started here, as well as Axii and the Realm of Metal, Chaman. So what's our region that we're throwing back to? Well, we're going back to the Scabaras sprawl. And this is an area of Guaran that if you were to imagine it kind of with, like, I guess, real-world forest type stuff, think of a pine forest that is always shrouded in a really thick fog. That's kind of the terrain that they're trying to move this massive crusade through. And the importance of this scene is twofold, and it's kind of briefly touched on, but the army's morale is falling apart. This region has all kinds of myths about it, because rumor has it Behemat, the world titan, fell and died somewhere around here, which of course we as the reader and all of the Stormcast Eternals in this entourage, this contingent, this crusade know that was actually history. That's not a myth. We have to remember that a lot of time passes between AOS 1.0 and where we're at now. And so this whole area is just really unnerving all the troops. In addition to that, scouts continue to go missing in the mists, and over time, the opinion as they keep trudging through this woods is that the soldiery is kind of turning against the Sylvaneth, right? As they're in this situation, like we're on a trail we don't know, with allies that we don't trust or like, is Drycha, like, you know, maybe she needs a tighter leash? Is she out there killing our scouts? And then over time it gets even worse. Did the Sylvaneth, like, lead us out here to kill us so that there wouldn't be any survivors, like, to go back and say that the pact was violated between Order factions? Like, everyone's kind of fallen apart. In addition to that, all of these survivors are, like, super sad because everyone's mourning Gardas deeply, which is quite frankly a sentiment that I struggle to understand. I'm gonna go on a little rant here, okay? Gardas sacrifices himself to save the day so many times in these stories. I am beginning to think that Gardas is to martyrdom what Bear Grylls is to drinking his own urine. Like, at a certain point you have to stop and think, you just wanted to do this, didn't you? This is an active choice. It didn't have to be your first response to all of your situations, but you made that decision. At me in the comments if you disagree, but that is my personal hot take. Point is, things are falling apart. At this point, the leader of this force, Marshal Isilia Thorian, has an idea, goes to the leader of the Oakenbrow, it's a spirit revenant, I think, and explains it. Basically says, we can hit two birds with one stone. We can strengthen our army and boost morale if you send out your Sylvaneth to go heal our troops. Sylvaneth having a lot of, Guaran life healing magic kind of a thing. And they do just that. He sends his Sylvaneth out, they're healing people with like sap from, I don't know, their branches or whatever, and they start carrying items for the soldiers and stuff, and what is this? They're acting like allies? And I, for one, was deeply offended because I did not get this book to learn about Friends Hammer. That's not what the game is called, but here they are, being buds. Now, immediately after this touching moment, the environment of Guaran itself begins to really start to test this fledgling trust or friendship. Because the sprawl begins to open up from that dense forest. There's some kind of open patches of plains, and when they enter these patches, they start to see these strange ivory towers. Dozens of them, lining the side of each direction they need to go. And at first they're like, oh crap, this has to be like an orc bastion or something. They think it's like rigged up to be like a very crude fortification of bones by the orcs, or maybe the Gloomspite Gits or something. Heck, maybe the Ossiarch Bone Reapers at this point. But nope, it's a ribcage. It is the ribcage of Behemat himself. So they're not just in the area, they literally walked through the corpse of this god beast that at this point has kind of been eaten away and consumed, but the skeleton still exists. And I couldn't help but chuckle. I made all those jokes about AOS 1.0 in the last video with Vanus and Corus Cole, but this is a moment where, like, let's literally take a walk towards AOS 4.0 by walking through the actual corpse of characters from 1.0. It was fantastic. I had enjoyed the heck out of it. And the humans on this crusade who thought these were all fairy tales, there's no behemoth that's as big as a mountain and all, whatever, they don't care about this. They're like, oh crap, it's real. And we begin to learn that the World Titan's corpse that they just left there, I'm not sure what I wanted them to do with it, but they just left a body there, had a dramatic effect on this area. Even though we're in Guaran, Behemat was a creature that carried so much primal power in him that his body basically poured a little slice of gur all over this region. So as his corpse was basically falling apart and being absorbed by the realm of life, it kind of became a little oasis of gur. And it has the usual result, the flora and the fauna becoming hyper aggressive, lots of predators. But they aren't seeing a lot of animals, very strangely. Like, that's kind of a strange gurish thing you'd expect, but it's not here. And it sets everyone really ill at ease. Because in the realm of life, and even within a small patch of gur in there, why is there no monsters? Why are there no... And the sudden change from walking through like Guaran-infused forest to gur-infused forest is very jarring to a lot of the people who are walking around. And as they move further into Gur Town, they start to hear screaming and begin seeing fresh footprints that look strange. The cities of Sigmar and the Sylvaneth begin bracing themselves because they're sending out scouts around trying to figure out what's going on. And they basically pinpoint that there's a unified roar coming from a singular direction at the heart of this region. So as they go further into the ribcage towards like the core of what Behemat's corpse was, things are getting crazier. Scouts crest over the ridge and find the source. It's an ogre maw pit. At the core of Behemat's chest cavity, there's a maw pot that's full of boiling blood and a few slaughtermasters. And notably, many of these ogres look deeply emaciated. Gorgers. Think ogres with like a wasting disease that drives them feral. Now let's pause there and learn a little bit about this particular ogre party. It's being led by Slaughtermaster Bulk Lumbergulp, which is the best name, who was around when King Broad from the last book came past them and pulled a bunch of their ogres into his stampede towards Fort Gardas. Now, Lumbergulp didn't go with them, didn't see a need to, but he loved the fact that somebody was taking the focus in a different direction. All the most thick-headed ogres who just wanted battle or whatever, they just went with him, leaving Lumbergulp and his crew of butchers and slaughtermasters to do whatever they wanted. And he's stoked about this because there's a ritual that he's been seeing in his dreams that he wants to do. And as a holy man, slaughtermaster, of the gulping god, he doesn't just want to do a ritual, he wants to do it in a specific place. Which brings us to now, where he sets up shop in the center of a god beast of destruction magic, or gur magic I should say, doing some kind of ritual to destruction in general. He's got several butchers and gorgers running around, tossing meat into the pot, snapping open Sylvaneth to drink the sap, like as Sylvaneth are just found in the woods or whatever, all drawn to this gollop. So it's a gollop is a term for the ritual feasting that Ogre-Maw tribes do. The Wildercore scouts are moving ahead and trying to find paths around this, right? They see it, it's kind of like in a deep crevasse in the center of his chest cavity, and they want to find a route to like, how can we get the Crusade to bypass this nastiness? And this is when the ritual that Lumbergold was doing kind of goes into next gear. The effects, primarily of which that are relevant right now, there are more effects later, but it makes the ground very unstable. Essentially, tiny maw pits begin to open all around them. So imagine like a tiny sarlacc pit just opening up and trying to eat your leg, pull you down into the sand. And as this is happening, a bunch of these scouts begin falling in. And as the survivors fall back, they begin to realize that all those ogres are now quiet, and they're staring at them, which means this fight is coming. Pause here. This is literally the creation and setup for that new Warcry warband set where it has the Gorgers and the human scouts from Cities of Sigmar. It's awesome. I love that they included it. These scouts make it back fast and just basically report in time that they have just a moment to set up gun lines and formations before a ravenous ogre horde descends upon them. And the battle I thought was pretty sick. The first elements of the ogres meet lines, and it's about what you'd expect. They just start tearing through humans because humans versus ogres is not great. For humans. But once the bulk of the ogre army meets them, meaning it's not just the initial fastest ones, but the real meat of the army is engaged, horns blare out from every direction, and one of the most aggressive Sylvaneth counterattacks begins. Now, it's important to understand when I say Sylvaneth counterattacks, these are not the allies that they've been traveling with. Those are on the front lines receiving the full brunt of the charge with the humans. They're dying right there alongside the Cities of Sigmar. This is an entirely different Sylvaneth force drawn for the same reason. Or I should say the same mission. Led by their new hero, Balthanos, the first Thorn of Kurnoth, with a slew of creatures with him. Some of which are, of course, Kurnoth hunters, which kind of have their name in it. But they also describe elves that are half deer, wielding bows and arrows and flutes, which gives me hope that one day, that really cool Underworld's warband will be turned into an army. And with this kind of change in the flow of combat, the hunters become the hunted, right? Balthanos arrives as soon as he could, but realized from the perspective that he was meeting up with the Crusade, he was like looking down upon the Crusade bearing into this maw pit situation. He's like, okay, I could go reinforce them, or I could kind of take a path to the left, skirt around the side, and then just, flank the ogre force. So he chose to do that instead of letting them know, hey, you have friends here. And, as brief as this book is, I really feel like it is rather short. This is a cool fight. I like the ebb and flow of it. The fighting of the butchers and the slaughtermasters are sweet. But ultimately, the ogres are just no match. Balthanos has a new model, and there's no stopping him. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek, but the lore reason for his arrival bringing such a significant change is because up till now, they've been in the sprawl, right? The power of Guaran is at their disposal. The Sylvaneth know how to control the environment that they're in. But now, they're in a slice of gur. The Sylvaneth cannot command the woods that they usually can, and this matters because when Balthanos enters on his Superfly, he can personally project Guaran energy back into this area. Now, why the Spite Revenant or the guy with the big horn couldn't do that is a little bit unclear. I thought that was kind of his whole thing when the Rite of Life happened, but Balthanos in this particular story is able to bring Guaran with him. And this is sweet, because simply put, Balthanos' presence means the woods are now working for the Cities of Sigmar. Like, trees bow and duck out of the way to open up firing lanes. Vines start grasping at ogres' legs so they can't move, and then the cannons and the guns of the humans absolutely light them up. Which, honestly, when I think about like the way fun ally stories should be. This is what I want, right? What do they each bring to the table, and then using them in tandem for devastating effect? If you're in Guaran, having the woods literally like jump out of the way of your gun so you can see the enemy is pretty great. Lashing them to the ground so they can't move away from, your fusillade wall is pretty great. In this fight, Marshal Thorian goes toe-to-toe with the Slaughtermaster, who's the named character leading all this, or not a named character, but the big one in charge here, and is able to use some very rudimentary life magic, basically vines that come out and bind the Slaughtermaster, which means that our Marshal Thorian here, who has consistently been my favorite character of this Crusade series, has some latent magic power there. With him bound, she's able to take him out, and with the Slaughtermaster's death, really the others scatter. And with the Maw tribe having been defeated soundly, the cities of Sigmar folks all start cheering. They're like, holy crap, we survived, there's no reason we should have, we probably should all be food. And at this, Balthanos holds up a finger to Thorian and is like, no. It was a very cool scene of they don't speak the same language, and him trying desperately to warn them is just very cool. So he's basically going, nope. And they start to realize very slowly the ritual that was started, right, that opened up the little tiny maw mouths and started eating up the scouts. Even though all the Slaughtermasters left the ritual point to come kill the cities of Sigmar and Sylvaneth, there's a rhythmic thumping that's going on, and it's only gotten more intense as the battle has ended. So Balthanos is there's something coming. They have already set some event in motion. Everybody brace yourself. And that's where I'm going to pause the Guaran side of the story today, but I have one little side thing. You see, at this moment when Balthanos is warning them, there is kind of a sidebar going on. And this is a continuation of a sidebar that we saw in the first video on this series. When the long hunt started, Kragnos was slamming against a wall in Gur looking for something. We find out that it's actually a realm gate. There's a realm gate that leads from Gur to Guaran and back and forth. That kind of has a river surrounding it, so when he's pounding the wall, water gushes out, but that's how they know they've hit something. From here, the next scene that we get in this one is that he arrives in Guaran, the Lord of Destruction himself. Specifically, at a long-abandoned settlement of Kragnos' people, the Drogruk. So we're getting a glimpse into him still trying to pick up the pieces of his life from millennia ago, which isn't, he's just struggling. And to the outside observer, it looks like Kragnos is going on a rampage. He's just darting around these old ruins of his old civilization, smashing open doors, doing everything he can. But there's one character who knows differently. That's Gobsprack. He's the super wise orc of the Cruel Boys named character. And he knows that Kragnos is in fact not destroying things, but is looking for signs of life. Messages, anything. And so secretly, Gobsprack sends out his Cruel Boys to look for any evidence as well. And on a cave wall, they find a crude ancient message with directions for survivors, meaning something happened at this civilization where Kragnos' people made an escape, and they left instructions for people behind them, but Gobsprack destroyed those instructions. Basically, they chiseled out that section of the cave wall without Kragnos noticing, which is a terribly mean thing to do. Even though Kragnos is not a good guy, but you know what I mean? He just took away all the traces of his people and probably chances of reconnecting them. And his logic is, Gobsprack is not here to be nice to Kragnos. We're not friends. He sees his duty as to bring Kragnos here to unleash him on Guaran, which I thought was a sweet ending. And so let's move into why is this cool, right? Talk about the events of this particular book. Really, the main event for this section of the story was just the ogre fight. And I have to say, I enjoyed the hell out of it. Thorian is an awesome character. Mainly because in the first books, I thought she was cool because she disseminated orders a lot, which is a cool mechanic that the cities of Sigmar have. And I thought it was a great representation, lore-wise, of a mechanical in-game thing. And vice versa. And as this goes on, she just gets cooler and cooler. Her going toe-to-toe with that Slaughtermaster. It tried to hack at her. She blocked it with a shield. The sword got stuck in the shield, and so then it basically became a giant ping-pong paddle. He pulled it away and just started beating her and bludgeoning her with the shield. And so, she's surviving all of this. This is when the Guaran magic comes out of nowhere. She has all these abilities that are getting unlocked as it floods into the area from Balthanos being there. It's just cool. I thought it was a great fight scene. To that point, I will say, if you are a Sylvaneth player, or one of those folks like many I've seen online who were just like, oh man, I saw Balthanos and I was like, I want to play that model, right? That he seems very appealing to a lot of Sylvaneth players. I will tell you, his fight scene delivers on that. This dude's a beast. He's not quite full Alariel where he's like making actual forests and Sylvaneth come into existence around him. But he's hacking and slashing with this Kurnothi type spear. He's got forest nymphs and stuff with him. It's just cool. Now, one thing I will agree with is that this was a very slow burn at the start. The entire first section of this part of this crusade was about building up this internal, I guess, friendship amongst the Sylvaneth and the cities of Sigmar. Talked about their depths of sadness, how they're trying to work together. And, you know, I think it could have been written maybe a little bit more succinctly, but the point is, this is a battle where having allies that you actually work with and trust was demonstrated in a cool and reasonable way. And we don't get a lot of those. A lot of this is like, we're allies with KO, and so we use their boats. It's like, well, okay, but like the KO have a lot of unique things in addition to boats. Highlight those. For example, like the Sylvaneth here, move the forest. You know what? I love that. It's just a unique ability that they would have never had access to on their own that now they do. And while this one might have seemed a little bit of an abrupt ending, I promise the next video is non-stop start to finish story arc. Because like I said, that ritual is still firing off and there's no delay. So friends, I hope you will join me for tomorrow's video as we further dive into the Guaran side of the twin-tailed Crusade. Let me know, Crusade. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, what you think of my comments. First of all, on Gardas. Does he sacrifice himself too much for me to care anymore? Maybe a little. But also, how do you feel about the Crusade so far when it comes to the Guaran side? I will say, I definitely like the characters in this side much more than the Akshi side so far. But I'd still rather be over there than in Guaran, man. I don't know, that's a tough toss-up. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I will hang out with you there. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming. Welcome, wargamers, to the quickly sundering lands of the mortal realms. This is Book 3 of the Dawnbringers campaign series, and Video 4 of its coverage. And for any of this to make sense, I have a playlist in the description down below. Go check that out and get yourselves caught up to the story, because I'm going to jump right into it. To add just a few details to pick up on, there was a huge ogre Maw tribe Maw pit ritual going on. Those ogres then attacked the Guaran Crusade, who were rescued by an outflanking maneuver led by Balthanos, the new Sylvaneth character that we got. It was a super cool fight scene, but before they could celebrate the victory over the ogres, the cities of Sigmar forces were warned by Balthanos. There's something coming. Right, the rhythmic pounding that was started by the Maw tribe ritual has only gotten louder after they left. Like, they started the ritual and then walked away, and you would think it would die out, but it just escalated. So something's coming. And what that is the topic of today's video. So we're going to follow what this ritual was about, what happens to the Twin-Tailed Crusade, and find out where their story ends at the end of the Long Hunt. Now, before we get into this next lore bit, we get another interesting sidebar. I talked about this last time. There was one sidebar that featured Kragnos coming into Guaran from Gur, and there's another one. In fact, this is probably best described as the Book of Sidebars. I will explain more detail later on, but in this one, it features Alariel atop her throne on the Oak of Ages Past. This is the ritual site for the Rite of Life that happened that basically set Age of Sigmar, 3.0 in motion. And Alariel's having a meeting with some very, very notable characters. There's Lord Croak of the Seraphon, who's hovering silently, and basically he doesn't speak so much as project ideas into people's brains, which means I assume he doesn't get invited to a lot of parties. But next to him is Krondis and Karazai. Now, these are the two new dragon heroes that we got with the most recent opening, addition to the Stormcast army. These are the named dragons, like the one kit you can build either way. And I'm just going to say I love the way these characters are written. There's some great dialogue from each of them that I feel like really does represent their tones quite well. But the short of it is this. They're seeing Kragnos bear down on Hammerhall Gyra Crusade. He came out of his, Rum Gate looking for his home, couldn't find anything, is really mad and is going to pick a fight with the first thing he sees, which they know from sort of a removed perspective is bound to be that Crusade. Alariel, who was already stretched thin by her, war against Nurgle at this point. Remember, that whole War of the Rains, or Dueling of the Rains, I think is what it was called, from the first book. Nurgle is trying to shower the area with blight, and Alariel in the background is constantly purifying it. So she's already maxed out. And she looks at Krondys and Karazai and says, you need to deal with this. Like, basically, get your stuff together. She demands that the brothers, basically deal with the sins of your past. I'm going to focus on Nurgle to keep the realm itself together, but you and Kragnos have a history that is your own. You need to deal with this, which I loved. I thought that was a fantastic scene. Croak, again, not saying much of anything, but he basically flashes a vision into everyone's head of where this trap needs to happen, and the Seraphon army that's prepared to strike in its aid. So there's kind of a plan, but only they know the details. We're just told that they have kind of flashes and inklings and stuff. And the dragons leave. They're like, all right, we'll go take care of it, goddess, and they head out. And as it's just Alariel and Croak, she kind of becomes, I guess, remorseful, and maybe not remorseful, but sad. And she starts to think about how Kurnoth isn't here to aid her like he did in the early part of the Age of Myth. Kurnoth is a character from the old world that was struck down in the Age of Chaos. It's very vague as to what happened to him, but obviously I'm thinking we're going to get that filled in a bit more. But she basically misses her partner. Croak at this point lifts a finger and projects her to seeing the battle with Balthanos. It gives her a little bit of clear insight into what's happening. And if you don't know this, as we mentioned before, Balthanos is a beacon of pure Guaran energy. So he stands out, and while no words were said, Alariel receives the message very clearly: Kurnoth is not lost to you, which is a super fun little lore nugget, but it also sets up the context for why we're going to see these characters in the next section, because otherwise it is far too left field. I won't lie, I flipped ahead a little bit just to kind of see what forces and characters were covered. When they brought up Krondys and Karazai, I was like, who? What? How did they get here? The sidebar explains it. So with that out of the way, let's snap back to the Guaran Crusade. Marshal Thorian barely has time to stand up from her fight with the Slaughtermaster. He body checked her pretty hard. But really before she can get her bearings, Kragnos is emerging from the woods behind them. The rear guard takes the brunt of Kragnos' assault. If you don't remember, I think it was the Shattered Realms Kragnos, or Broken Realms Kragnos book, they had a scene of him basically trying to assault the city of Excelsis, and he was just a stampede and made waves of earthquakes behind him. But that whole fight scene, they were behind a huge wall. This is just dudes walking in the woods. So when it says he tears up their rear guard, I'm thinking dudes slicing down people in the hundreds. And the stories kind of connect here because it becomes clear Kragnos exited the realm gate, couldn't find his old home or anyone there. So they came because they heard the initial ritual thumping that it was causing. But then as our heroes heard the thumping increase and get bigger after the battle with the Maw tribes, it turns out it wasn't the ritual. It was the shields of the Cruel Boys being slammed in rhythm with what the ritual was. So that's pretty cool. They basically let out a flare, and then a whole different destruction army caught the rhythm and moved right in. But to that end, the Orc army surges in too, along with Gobsprack. Balthanos is headed that way, but he's all the way at the front of the Crusade, so he has to take some time to move back. And the description of Kragnos' charge is epic, right? Each step causes earthquakes, it's tearing up the bones of Behemat himself. So there's osseous shrapnel in the air, it's very metal. And to break up this slaughter, Krondys descends from the sky. And what's interesting is the battle is pretty clear. The mortals on the ground mean nothing instantly. All the orcs and all the humans and all the Sylvaneth really kind of toned down the fighting because everyone's much more interested in watching a dragon fight a god of earthquakes, which is fair enough. And honestly, the fight is a little bit of a disappointing one because it's not a fight. Basically, Krondys begins to kite Kragnos. When you shoot him just at the limit of your range and you kind of keep pulling him in a direction to chase you. And he's leading Kragnos to the edge of the battlefield. But Kragnos refuses to fall for it. If Krondys is not going to fight fair, neither will I. So instead of chasing after the dragon, Kragnos begins smashing Behemat's bones, which starts to collapse on the Crusaders. Remember, these are megalithic ivory towers, so as they're falling, it's like a skyscraper falling in the middle of a block full of people. And this forces Krondys to engage, where he body slams Kragnos. It was a pretty cool scene, because he basically just bounces off, which is exactly what you'd expect if you've ever played against Kragnos on the table. God of Destruction grabs the dragon by the neck, pins him to the ground, and while he is staring Krondys down, a series of detonations echo all around them. Because even though Kragnos wasn't pulled to where Krondys wanted to take him, he was out of the dead center of the battlefield, and all of those explosions were the cannons, the fusiliers, the everything with a gun pointed from the Cities of Sigmar army directly at Kragnos. Because all of that gave Marshal Thorian a moment to set her lines and basically gets to pelt Kragnos unobscured with cannon fire, which is really cool. And this fire doesn't just go on Kragnos, but on the orcs too, and it's enough to knock Kragnos down and loosen his group on Krondys the dragon, who flies away. Kragnos at this point loses his cool, right? He was thinking smart before about not getting, led around by the nose, but he has just lost his mind, so he just runs. And he is led into a place called the Banyan Gulf, where an ambush awaits. The final scene we get for this, I thought, was a very strange one. So, essentially, Krondys is flying towards this canyon. He's got Kragnos stampeding behind him. And in this gulf, Karazai, the other brother of the dragons, and a full army of Seraphon and Dracolith stand ready. And as Krondys flies over, the two brothers have this cool nod moment where they're just double dragon style, I got you, bro. And Kragnos appears. Karazai roars and charges, again, an assembled force of everything remotely lizard-like descending on him, and the scene fades to black, which I kind of despised them for, to be honest with you. Telling me there's this awesome trap and then not delivering on what it does is kind of like showing a gun on the wall, but then not doing anything with it. Yeah, I know it exists, but you haven't proven consequences. So I was and yeah, that's it. That is where the story of the Guaran Crusade. They just got beat up by Kragnos a little bit. There's still an orc army at their footsteps, so that's a big issue. But this whole side quest out of left field of Kragnos coming in, and then Alariel with these other big characters being deal with this, was pretty stinking cool. Now, speaking on that note of what's cool, let's talk about why is this cool. One thing I want to throw out here, this book, okay, unlike the other ones, I should say, it has an ending that is a lot like Lord of the Rings. If you know what I mean. There's 15, that's being dramatic, but there's a lot of sidebars that have resolutions and hints for the next book in the series that are not in and of themselves stories. It's by the 5th ending of Lord of the Rings, you're if I see Elijah Wood more time, I'm going to slap him in the face. End the movie or don't. All 4 no play is not fun. Give me the credits. And this basically did the same thing. So what I'm going to do is another video coming out tomorrow that addresses all of those things. So going basically panel by panel, what are the hints, the teasers, the setups that we get in this book for the next one, as well as reviewing the thing as a whole. I will say, looking back on the Crusades at this point, this book, it really didn't do much for me. And by that I mean, I like the armies of renown that it came with. I actually liked the scene with Alariel, Croak, Kragnos, and Karazai. Oh my god, there's way too many K names in this story. This is the dumbest idea to put all these characters in one book. But the interesting thing here is that those were all characters that were foundational to AOS 3.0's start. It happened at the Oak of Ages Past, with Alariel doing the Rite of Life. The 2 dragons came back as a direct result of Kragnos, who came back because of this Rite of Life freed him. The original cage he was in was by Lord Croak, and he's been instrumental in kind of containing Kragnos throughout this whole season. So while I don't feel like the book, The Long Hunt, really added much or pushed the story really meaningfully forward at all, I do feel like this was intended to be a nice bow on AOS 3.0, and I feel like the last story was a cool reminder of AOS 1.0. I don't know, there was good fight scenes. I really wish it hadn't have ended on such a bland note of trouble's coming. It's well, I can do that to my audience because I'll have another 15-minute video for you tomorrow. You can't do that to me, GW, because you're not going to have this book out for 2 months. I kid. I think the real core of these books has been that in this one, the theme has been like rearming. So the Akshi Crusade has Fire Slayers and Stormcast. The Black Talons are with them. There's there are actually now several Stormcast armies in the area between Ionus and Vanus kind of going their separate ways. And in Guaran, we were reinforced with a lot of Sylvaneth. And possibly something new. Kurnoth seems to be getting his own faction, and that makes me excited. If you have any knowledge about Kurnoth, because again, I always lean on people who played fantasy battles a lot when it comes to old world lore. There's just too much to have to find and source, and so much of it's out of print. If you could give me a little rundown on Kurnoth, I always try to pin the most helpful comments here to the top of the page, so if you could educate me and my fans, I would deeply appreciate that. It was always kind of vague as to where Kurnoth fit into things in AOS. It seems like he was like the royal consort and just love interest of Alariel throughout the Age of Myth. Her personal hunter, or man of the hunt, and so he would go out and, I guess, try and defend her from Nurgle when that first started, and then he fell to Nurgle himself, I think. It's been a long time, honestly. Anyway, friends, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I would love to hang out and chat with you tomorrow as we review all the different endings of The Long Hunt. Thank you so much for watching, and happy wargaming. Welcome, wargamers, to the teasers of the future of the Mortal Realms, because today we are talking about all of the different, I guess, ending slides. I kind of described it as the very many endings of Lord of the Rings, where it just kind of keeps having closing shot after closing shot, and you just kind of get that feeling after the fourth one of like, end the movie or don't. I just want to leave. Well, basically, Book 3 of the Dawnbringers campaign series, The Long Hunt, did this exact thing, and the videos were getting a little long earlier in the week, and there's a lot of really fun tidbits that they threw out at the end here with these little like sidebars that I wanted to talk about, because some of them have nothing to do with the stuff that was in this particular tale of the Twin-Tailed Crusade, but they set up stuff that might be in the next one. Now, if you want to get caught up and hear these theories or whatever, I have a link in the description down below to the playlist. Go get caught up with the Dawnbringers campaign series, and I'll be here for you. There's a ton of postscript stories here, and so we're going to go through each one of them and speculate wildly, because it's fun. Okay, friends, let's do our notes at the end here, breakdown. So there was some of them are related to the story of the Long Hunt, some of them are not, and I'll kind of pull attention to which ones are. So we start off with one that is Gobsprack. If you don't know, Gobsprack is the named character of the Cruel Boys. He's like the leader on Vulcha, the shaman leader on Vulcha. And he's a very interesting character. His motivations are very unclear. Up until this point, he has been the only character who can understand Kragnos. I don't know if Gorka Morka put a babblefish in each of their ears that's just tuned to each other or what, but when Kragnos broke out of his mountain, it seems that Gobsprack is able to intuit what he is saying, feeling, and that kind of stuff, but nobody else can. So he's kind of the interpreter, in addition to a lesser warlord. And we definitely got the sense in this book that Gobsprack has his own motivations. Before, I didn't feel like it was as clear. It seemed like he was just very happy to serve Kragnos, which I don't think that made, that wouldn't make sense. But this book really implies that there's more going on. He wanted Kragnos gone. And it kind of frames his whole participation in this story as, okay, were you just using Kragnos to get to Guaran? And then you wanted him away so that you could do whatever you wanted, which would kind of make me think that the Cruel Boys were going to be featured heavily in the next arc of the story. Or did you want him gone so that you can slink back to the shadows, and then Games Workshop could use that as an impetus for, why Kragnos is in X place, and maybe why, Chaos is now ascendant again, or, whatever they want to do for the next major story arc there. The idea of, destroying remnants of Kragnos's people I thought was particularly malicious and mean, but it does paint Gobsprack as being, a very conniving character, and I like that. That's really the only resolution we get for Kragnos and Gobsprack at this moment. It just definitely seems that he got the outcome that he wanted. Kragnos is now in Guaran. They are as well, but now Kragnos is on his own in a trap by the forces of order, and to our knowledge, as far as where the story left off, The Crow Boys, they're getting shot at by cannons, but I mean, they're not like destroyed or anything. They're still an entity on themselves. So that's a note that we could go down, a road that we can go down rather, in the next book. There's also a letter to a Lord Imperatant. So this is just kind of attached here at the end of the book. It is to a Lord Imperatant from a Stormcast Eternal leader. And he's basically reporting in a bunch of strange things that happened in Akshi. The writer of this letter says that, here we were, my band of Stormcast, we're fighting a Tzeentch warband, and we're doing okay, but then this guy on a dragon, Ionus Cryptborn of all people, if you can believe that hero, he flies in to aid us. The fighting goes down. Of course, with Ionus's reinforcements and stuff like that, it's easily won at this point. And then Ionus Cryptborn left when the fight was over. They were like, hey, we saw you guys in trouble, we just wanted to help you out. The overall tone of this letter is very positive of like, we were ambushed, but we have, thanks Sigmar, we have friends in high places. But the letter ends with this very strange little note that I wanted to share with you. This Stormcast Eternal leader, who's writing to his Lord Imperatant, says, there are 9 souls that are unaccounted for. That is to say, the troops are missing, but they didn't arc back to Azir, and it has nothing to do with the Cursed Skies thing. I don't know how he intuits that, but basically that's the idea of the letter. So it's both good news and a weird notification. Now, let's talk about this for a second. Ionus Cryptborn. I like him, but he's a creepy dude. He has this aura of death all around him all the time. He's basically a Stormcast chaplain, and he's changed a lot since we saw him. Like I said, I'm going to do a dedicated video on Ionus, but we haven't seen the full revelation of why he's doing this quite yet. If you remember, when he flew in to save Vanus, he did the exact same thing. Flew into a battle that was already hopping, or about to start, and absolutely flips the tide, but then when he leaves, he takes people with them. This is an interesting idea. So, with Vanus, he showed him the writ and said, I have authority to take whoever I want. But in this other story, where it's not his friend that he's taking people from, it's more secretive. But the same story happened twice. Stormcast were fighting, Ionus flies in, fights, and takes the best and brightest or whatever, takes a few Stormcasts with him. But now there's deception in it, which quite frankly just makes it interesting. And so that is our plot point. I would love to hear in the comments down below what you think this means. In my mind, I am so curious if the Tzeentch warband has anything to do with it. And by that I mean in AOS 1.0, in Chamon, there was actually a fortification that if a Stormcast died near it, it would suck their soul into the wall and power the fort. So is it about the Tzeentch warband doing that, or is it about Ionus doing something like that? Maybe as Stormcast dies, he's collecting them instead of letting them go back to Azir. Very cool stuff. I'd love to hear all the theories down below. We now zap to a new, again, I'm telling you, there's a whole bunch of endings to this story. Here's the next postscript story we got. Astria Soulbright, who's just the most left field character. This is the name character on Dracoline or whatever, the Dragon Cats. She steps into Guaran from Shyish with her Stormcast chamber along with her. And as they explore this area immediately outside of this realm gate, they fail to see that they are being watched by maddened eyes. And that's really the only clue that we get. So of course I'm thinking Flesh Eater Courts. Since this publication, Games Workshop has been very clear, Flesh Eater Courts are coming. They even showed us that new sweet model with wings. I love it. And while the obvious teaser for this story is that the Flesh Eater Courts are coming, right? Don't need to dwell on that one. I find it interesting that Astria Soulbright, of all characters, is here. Now, of course, she's a Hammer of Sigmar, so having any kind of mission related to Guaran or Akshi makes sense. Hammer halls in both of them. That's their big city. But for her to be recalled from her mission in Shyish is interesting because her whole job, if you don't know Astria Soulbright, her mission in life is to study death and resurrection. So she goes to Shyish to hunt vampires to learn more about their secrets of immortality. She'll go mess around in dungeons full of night haunt to go learn about what persists their souls and their minds to the mortal realms, all these kinds of things. So why is a death expert in Guaran? while I don't know, and I'm very curious to learn about the trail that brought her here, she's on the money. I mean, there's a flesh eater court, court, I guess, right around her, surrounding her when the story ends. But basically, I want to know the story of what the path of devastation that this court did that caught her specific attention. I would love to know that story, and I'm excited to hear about it. And honestly, I think with that, have they touched every single named character that the Stormcast Eternals have? Like outside of like special holiday models, but with the exception of Gardas, all their named characters are like keyword locked to Hammers of Sigmar, which is Hammerhall is their Stormkeep. But it's just like, man, they're really bringing everybody into this, and I love it. Okay, next sidebar is we actually get a tiny little prelude to the next story coming up in the series. Dawners, as they're called on these Dawnbringer crusades. Can I just say, I think that's a terribly unfortunate name. As an American, I always just think of the Donner Party. So to have your whole group of like thousands of people in two different directions called Dawners, it trips a few wires. But our little foreshadow here is that their deepkin quote-unquote allies that they have now use their magics to wipe the minds of the cities of Sigmar people just a little. If you don't know, the deepkin can basically erase your short-term memories so that their existence can remain hidden. And they basically were like, you guys have been through a lot, so let's just make you forget like the last week. And it just kind of eases the soul a little bit. I'm like, man, I wish I could do that. That's some eternal sunshine of the spotless mind kind of stuff right there. And we also pan over to Corus Cole, who is debating an assault. And that's what I'm saying. These are like super tiny micro entries. It is Corus Cole debating on if he should go attack a particular settlement, but then he decides to focus on something greater, but what that is unclear. My guess from the context of the story is he is resuming his quest for, demonhood, becoming a demon prince. Because just as Vanus has been obsessed with Corus Cole this whole time, Corus Cole has been obsessed with the fact that Vanus denied him his rightful place at his, pyramid of skulls that he had built. So Corus Cole is like confirmed to be an active player in the story, and I don't see any reason to think he won't be in the next book with how heavily they've talked about him, his position, what he wants to do here. We also see that the Guaran Crusade is able to get some rest finally. The Sylvaneth allies that are with them depart for the most part. I mean, there's still some Sylvaneth along with them, but that whole Belthanos arm of the army that came in to meet up with them and save them, they basically split. They were like, my job's not done. We're going Gorger hunting. I'm Kernhoth's boy. I'm the spirit of the hunt. I'm going to go find me some Gorgers. And that's basically what they do. The Crusade makes it to its next outpost, which is strangely abandoned. But nothing was taken. And there on the wall are written praises to someone called the Summer King. And the Dawners follow in the direction of the footsteps leading away. Okay, that's a lot of endings. You know what I mean? Now that I've listed them all out there, do you see what I mean about the Lord of the Rings comparison, where it's just constant? Like any one of these could have been the final little text, but you just kind of kept going. So let's talk about why this is cool, or really probably a more accurate translation of that is, what does this get me excited for? Well, for one, I like the idea that the characters that were part of Kragnos' story, so Alariel, Croak, the two dragons, Kragnos himself, and Gobsprack, I love that they were all in the same story together. It would have been very annoying to have like Kragnos in one and then Alariel in the other, and have to kind of patch their two responses to one another in, across books. This was short and brief. She saw what was coming. They're like, we need a trap. You two, pointing to the dragons, deal with your garbage. I am busy. And then everything is just a result of them trying to do that. It just so happened that the Crusade was walking in the area to be the perfect bait. So as far as my disdain of things coming from completely left field, this is not as egregious to me as the Deepkin in the last book. The last story regarding the Astria Crusade. Because at least this one, at the beginning of the book, and I think a preview at the end of the last one, it was set up that Kragnos was going to be coming into Guaran, so it just didn't feel crazy. And I liked his fight scenes. Him pinning Krondis by the throat against the wall felt like probably the most accurate battle report that Games Workshop's ever put out. Whatever's going on with Ionus Cryptborn has me very interested, because he has been a great insight into I guess, the decay or the devolvement of Stormcast. So he was really, truly the first Stormcast to have a flaw. When we were introduced to Age of Sigmar 1.0 and the Stormcast came down, a accurate and I think rightful problem that people had with it is that there were no consequences because the Stormcast would just be remade and reborn, and when the game launched, things like flaws weren't really talked about. But they existed, sort of. Ionus Cryptborn, whenever he would die and get reforged, he would have terrible nightmares of a dark figure who's constantly clawing at his soul. We get the idea that that's Nagash, for Ionis's vision specifically. So even when all the other Stormcast were, golden, glistening, perfect boys, he always had an edge that there's something not right about Ionus. The idea of him taking souls is a very cool one. I'm curious if that's going to turn into any kind of mechanical gameplay. What if instead of Stormcasts blowing up and going to the sky, what if instead, if you had a relictor of some kind, they could absorb the soul and then use it as a buff? So you had to have something die to have a 1-to-1 exchange for a buff. I think that could be really, really cool. If nothing else, it certainly fits narratively with the chaplaincy of the Stormcast Eternals equivalent, I guess. I'm just excited to see Astria Soulbright moving into other parts of this wrap-up here. I like her as a character. I like the idea of Stormcast having a mission. So Neeve Blacktalon, right? What's your job? I am the God King's assassin. You unleash the dogs on someone, right? That's Neeve Blacktalon. With Astria, it's research. She wants to know everything there is to know about the idea of death. And basically all this research funnels into her trying to undo or at least freeze Stormcast Eternal flaws. So no one gets worse. And hopefully, ideally, if possible, we can make the broken people better. Reverse what's been done. So bringing that motivation into this story is a very interesting one, especially knowing that Flesh Eater Courts are going to be an integral part of this. Because at that point, we're not just talking about the relationship of life and death, which the Flesh Eater Courts also, I feel, are a good representation of that struggle and that dichotomy, but also of perception and reality. And it's hey, what fun two themes can you throw together? That sounds good. And beyond that, there's nothing else besides, I was a little bit bummed to see Belthanos come and go in a single book, but he was a really cool character. I'd love to see more stories that involve him later. And the reoccurring thing that Corus Cole is coming back has me, again, excited. I mentioned that in my videos on the Actually side of the Crusade here. But I'm just pumped to know that these characters I like are coming back. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. What do you see coming down the pipeline? What is your thoughts and expectations? Let's take Flesh Eater Courts off the table. That's already a given. We know that. Dazzle me with ideas, people. Let me know what your thoughts are down below, and I'll catch you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the beaten and beleaguered corners of the Mortal Realms, because today we are talking about Dawnbringers, The Mad King Rises, which is book 4 of the Dawnbringers series. This here is part 1 of its coverage on the channel. Now, many of you have been asking about the hiatus from the Dawnbringer series. I promise it's not because I don't want to talk about it. I just had a lot of trouble in actually getting these books. So I had to wait until I went to Adepticon, and I was able to find some of the vendors there who were very wonderful and held copies for me. Shout out to Grognard Games, and made sure that I had the Mad King Rises and the newest one, Shadow of the Crone, I think it is. So we're going to jump right into these series. So if you've been waiting for it, boom, here it is. Now, if you're just catching up on this channel, this is sort of the current meta-narrative of Age of Sigmar, straight from the timeline. But to understand it, you're going to need to catch up because I have all of the Dawnbringer videos into one Uber playlist for you. And you're going to need that because what started as the grandest crusade of mortals to step into a realm of unfettered chaos has devolved into two desperate groups of pioneer refugees shuffling ever more faintly to the finish line. It's been a fantastic story. And a few of the other books in the series do this, sort of like a preface, right? It's sort of like a bird's eye view of what is affecting both sides of the Hammerhand Crusade. And then it addresses them individually, going to Guaran and Akshi respectively. This book, however, is a little bit different because it has action for us and it jumps directly into the Guaran side of the Hammerhand Crusade, which is great because frankly, it's the one I'm far more interested in. Okay, so in the last book here in the Dawnbringers series, things got real crazy real fast. The Guaran Crusade was intercepted by Kragnos, who was ultimately led away by the Dragon Brothers into the shadowy mists of nowhere, I guess, and the orc army that surrounded Kragnos was fought off by the Sylvaneth, who got their new mini Belthanos. But one thing they pointed out very quickly here is that Belthanos, while he is following the orders of Alariel, to help the Crusade, he's really there to hunt, right? Helping the Crusade at that moment was sort of a mutually beneficial thing to Belthanos' actual mission of hunting. He is a creature that is infused with the power of the hunter god Kurnoth, and really the point is, he's not staying with the Crusade. And so he makes like a tree and leaves, taking all the rest of the Sylvaneth with them. So at the end of that story, they gained some friends, and then some departed from them on good terms, mind you. But there are a few other things going on with the Guaran side of the Crusade that really do bear mentioning, like its current state. First off, they are surprisingly good on supplies. They lost a lot of lives in all this journey so far, but not the metaliths. Those are like the floating rock formations that kind of use them as pack mules and built-in fortifications, that kind of stuff. So presumably, if they can reach their destination, they're actually still looking really good on successfully establishing a city. Their leader, Marshal Thorian, has become a real galvanizing force amongst the Crusade. Not like the religious leader over on the Akshi side, but more like a force of character. She went toe-to-toe with an ogre boss in the last book, and while it nearly shattered her, it did unlock some nascent, power within her. Her hand, which was torn up from the ogre swatting her shield away, had now kind of like a faintly green glow to it. There were small bits of bark growing on it. She is clearly infused with Guaran magic in some capacity, and she gains a reputation and even a moniker, the Dame of Leaves, which I am sure sounds really cool with like a smooth and posh British accent, but I hear Dame of Leaves in like my heckling voice from people in New Jersey when I grew up. Like, hey, look, it's the Dame of Leaves. What's next? The toots of twigs, the broad of branches. And I don't want to joke too much because she's actually one of my favorite characters and it's a super cool name. But I read that and I had to reread it a few times for that to sound like, oh yes, the Dame of Leaves. I'm sure it sounds very cool. That is my own brokenness slipping in here. But anyway, the Crusade is headed north through a thick forest of the area called the Neck. Basically, it's a narrow strait that there's simply not a lot of information on. It's kind of like a narrow stretch of land that connects two continents, and so it is kind of the neck that goes between two worlds. Now, approaching this, Thorian knows that there is not a lot of information, and so she begins to lean very heavily upon her scouts, right? This becomes critical. At the same time as all of that is happening, they're still being assaulted by the melancholic plagues of Nurgle, random attacks by orcs, usual Guaran stuff. And the story kind of picks back up for us in this narrative with the scouts reporting back something that is truly unexpected. A wall of bone. Now, death armies are not terribly common in the realm of life. It's not generally their scene. Doesn't mean they can't be there, but it's just not their natural habitat. But this Crusade walks into an open strait, and sure enough, there's like a wall, like a mega wall. It goes from horizon to horizon. It actually divides the neck. And the scouts are coming in, right? They keep coming in from further west and further east, and it just keeps going and going. It is a continental divide defense line that no one knew existed. Almost like it's being quarantined somehow. Now, the Guaran Crusade is looking at this, and as the reports are coming in, we're getting a lot of information and making a few logical observations. It is, without question, an Ossiarch Bone Reaper's construct that has all the hallmarks of their artisanship, the little, artistic edges and designs. This is clearly not something that's put together by, say, a White King or something like that. There are little towers along the wall that each emanate a little bit of death magic, but like a very, very small amount. In fact, all the scouts confirmed the wall looks pretty beat up. Like maybe these were exuding massive amounts of magic and keeping the area kind of undead before, but it seems to have really taken a hit. And there's some debate, like, okay, is it falling into disrepair because the Ossiarch Bone Reapers are no longer here, right? And it's just kind of fallen apart over time, or was it taking a hit with the magic that happened during the Rite of Life that Alariel did? Was there another army or Nurgle that came in and kind of atrophied the wall? And it's as they are discussing these options that an Ossiarch Bone Reaper emissary appears on one side of the wall, and he projects a whisper that the whole Crusade can hear with an offer. Which, that has to be so creepy. You just see one tiny little silhouette on this wall in the distance, and then everybody like hears the whisper as if they're standing right next to them. That's creepy as all get out. And here's the offer. Leave now, and we're not going to come after you. Even better, if you decide to settle a city within eyeshot of this wall, I'll even hold off the bone tithe that we're going to collect from you for 100 years. Now that's a heck of a bargain in Ossiarch Bone Reaper terms. Go away, or I'm not going to force you to go away, but if you choose to stay, there'll be taxation. Marshal Thorian essentially tries to stall him to give her lead engineer a chance to think about this, right? Essentially being like, okay, I need you to think about worst case scenario. If we have to get through this wall, how are we going to do it? I'm going to go slow things down. And I really like to imagine the stalling negotiations with the Ossiarch Bone Reapers. Like, well, okay, hold on, get all rules lawyery about it. When you say within eye shot, does that mean like your eyes? Because you, sir, have no eyes. What is your eye shot? Let's get to the details here. When you say 100 years, which calendar are we talking about? And because we were thinking of making our own calendar where it only, kind of does like once every 7 years is a year for us, like dog years. Rules lawyering. I like that kind of stuff. That'd be kind of fun. Eventually, the Ossiarch Bone Reaper guy is just like, no more, and he just attacks. Armies start mobilizing, and the Crusade does the coolest trick that they have done this entire book series, in my opinion. Instead of hitting these walls with traditional artillery, which the Guaran side of the Crusade does have, just not nearly as much as the Akshi side, their engineer loads the cannons with massive seeds called Weirdrans. That's Wyrdrons, Weirdrans. Now, we learn that the original design for these weird seeds was to plant a border along the city. When they hit the ground or whatever they're going to be planted in, they explode outward in growth and form massive barbed plants that choke the ground. The idea being, you decide where your city is going to be and you can create a natural barricade around you exceptionally fast to give you more time to do more secure kind of defenses. Which is really cool. And they get fired into these Ossiarch Bone Reaper walls, which again, were a bit kind of falling apart already, and they explode with growth. Because the engineer, while Thorian was stalling, noticed all the weak points in the fort, and having something blow up with life magic specifically and growth from inside the walls collapsed whole sections of it. And it turns out most of the Ossiarch Bone Reaper army was like along the walls, so they went down with it. At this point, the Crusade kind of gets themselves together, and they just make a beeline directly through this caved-in wall section. There's not really a lot of detail about this particular fight, other than the Guaran side punches a hole and they make their way into what seems to be some kind of cordoned off Ossiarch Bone Reaper empire that no one knew about. But we do learn a few things as this encounter is going on. First of all, Death is doing something big in Guaran. The Ossiarch Bone Reapers are renowned for constantly pushing their lines forward. Why are they stopped? What would stop the advance of them? Why would they let their walls fall apart if they were still here? And frankly, the leader didn't really seem like he wanted to fight. Like, he certainly didn't want to fight that day, right? Go away or we'll come in 100 years if you land in eyeshot. He wasn't looking for a fight that day or even that decade. Why didn't he want to fight? Now our story then kind of zooms out a little bit here, and it mentions that from the high ledges, out of sight of these combatants, strange ghoulish figures babbled to one another and scurried away. At some point in the fight, Thorian loses consciousness, basically just knocked out, and the Crusade presses deeper into the neck. So that was our first encounter battle. The Ossiarchs let them pass through, presumably to stay back and rebuild the wall, I guess. But for our crusade, it gets a little rough because the landscape begins to change. It goes from fairly level, dense forest, which made things hard but not impossible, to more of a jagged and divided territory. If you've been to a mountain range, one of those really steep ones, you can kind of see like the path breaks up into a bunch of smaller roads that all kind of crest down in different directions. And so to get through this, the crusade has to divide up a bit. They're too big for any one path to accommodate them. Now, it turns out that the Guaran side of the crusade knew that there were going to be parts of the forest or the natural environment that were too big for the crusade as a whole, so they actually had like a division of authority to make this possible. So everyone just kind of pauses here, assuming there's an Ossiarch Bone Reaper on their tails, but they don't know, divide into their little sub-camps, and then start making their way through these passes. So it's nice that they have a plan, but still, it's never good to split up. Now, a few things to note here, that this is a super weird set of valleys and canyons. A lot of little dark caves and cubbies here, and atop several of the mountains lining the sides are keeps. They're old and dilapidated and abandoned. At the center of the region, on one particular mountain, is a super fortress. And it seems like it's being used as the reference point for everyone, and it's like all roads lead to it. So even though the Crusades split up, all their individual paths kind of seem to be bringing them certainly within eyeshot, but very near to this citadel. And this is where our perception follows the Dawners in this whole crusade, because some soldiers hear phantom trumpets at night. Some see it as a beautiful monument to artistry, like the building on top of this tower is incredible and it's a beautiful, monument to the architecture of man. Most see it as a burnt-out wreck of a long-forgotten civilization. But you were beginning to get the sense that everyone's perceptions are not on the same page. Either way, everyone's attracted to it and immediately repelled by that idea of going there at the same time. That is, until a chance meeting. As Thorian's honor guard move through the valleys, they're beginning to pick up traces of arcane magic that they know somebody else is in the area, right? Something else is loose in these canyons with us. But it seems to be an arcane power that feels rejuvenating instead of foreboding. There's not this looming chaos sense, it's like a light in the darkness. And they chance upon a small warband of Stormcast Eternals led by Astria Soulbright. I did a dedicated video on her, but in very short, she is a named Knight Incantor, or Lord Incantor, whatever she is, who rides a Dragolith, and her eternal mission is to find a way to fix the flaw in the Stormcast Eternal reforging. She studies the magics of life and death. Specifically, she studies vampires, and she wants to unlock the secret of a seamless resurrection and a way to beat death. That search brought her here, and there was an awesome story about it on Warhammer Community about her kind of like following the pieces of undead armies that brought her to this point. And at this point, the two groups, right, the Stormcast and the Cities of Sigmar, take inventory of one another, and they come up with an agreement. Thorian, who has since woken up, will aid the Stormcast Eternals in exploring that big castle on the top of the rocks to see what secrets of death magic may be within it. Afterwards, Astria Soulbright and her Stormcast Eternals will escort the Crusade through the neck. And it seems like a win-win. This is the kind of like tit-for-tat that we see a lot in the grand alliances of order, right? I have a very short-term objective, help me achieve this, and I will help you achieve your longer-term one. So, this honor guard and a bunch of Stormcast Eternals begin all walking up to this castle on a hill. And I like how the book calls out how nice Astria Soulbright is, like very specifically, because as they approach this thing, the types of delusions that we chatted about in the Flesh Eater Court series begin. And any other Stormcast Eternal would have just killed all of these humans immediately who mentioned it. Generally speaking, to the Stormcast, once you and those mortals aren't seeing the same thing, you kind of become a liability. But Astria, as a scholar, is noting their perceptions. She's trying to put the pieces together of what are we dealing with, right? She's looking at the mortals as like, okay, there's a reaction happening. What can I deduce about it? She's understanding they're all kind of going a little insane, but not incoherently insane. There's some kind of form to it. At this point, they crest the hill, the castle's right there, and the gates burst open and thousands upon thousands of ghouls spew out. So many, in fact, that Astria immediately realizes we are in huge trouble. The wall of ghouls comes right at them and stops dead in their tracks about a spear's length away. Not like actually dead, but the crowd came to a full stop and was just hollering and chittering and screaming. Imagine thousands of these things just right in front of you. They run right up to you and then you just stop and are yelling at you. And it's at this point that Astria realizes they're trying to talk to us. And it's only because of her arcane power that she can kind of catch snippets of the delusion without being lost to it completely, because after a bit she kind of like lets her hearing settle and she can hear and discern the phrase honored guests. After a weird pause, a vampire walks up in the center of the Flesh Eater Court throng and she speaks plainly to the forces of order. No harm is going to come to you here. The Summer King welcomes you to dinner. And our scene drops. Now let me point out, this vampire lady is the snake tamer that just got her box a little bit ago. And we are going to do a deep dive on that because there's a much larger plot going on that she represents that I'm very interested. She deserves her own video. But we're going to pause here because we are all set up for the dinner party of the century. And I am very excited for tomorrow's video. So let's take a step back here and ask, as we always do, why is this cool? Well, first of all, I love the fact that they found a way to fit 3 death armies into a single story. You've got Ossiarch Bone Reapers at the gate, Flesh Eater Courts with the ghouls, and that vampire is a member of the Soulblight Gravelords. And honestly, they all feel like they're interacting like they should. The Bone Reapers don't care about tedious plans. They have a very straightforward solution. In this case, well, their job is to just stand there and guard the wall, which they didn't do so well. The Flesh Eater Courts are accurately depicted as mad raving lunatics, and the Soulblight Gravelord vampire there with the snake, she is all kinds of awesome and just walks confidently amongst the madness. Individually, these scenes weren't much, but collectively, they show you a really cool idea of what the Grand Alliance Death ecosystem could be like. How they all play off one another, they use one another for machinations. It's really cool. Marshal Thorian continues to be my favorite hero of this story so far, an absolute icon. And I did think adding Astria Soulbright was a good play. Like, I like that her mission overlaps so seamlessly with the current situation and the forces involved in this book in particular. I enjoyed it. It didn't feel forced. She's always been a character that's kind of like Neeve Blacktalon. Like, they're always out and about in the background, so like it feels less like a MacGuffin when people encounter them. Many people would have encountered them. And that's awesome. I often feel that way about different, like, dwarf slayers, that kind of stuff. Just they're out on these adventures, and so they are a known quantity. So it doesn't feel so forced. But like I said, we are all set up for an awesome dinner feast. Let me know your thoughts on the Ossiarch Bone Reapers. Why would they have that bargain? And question, would you take them up on it if they let you just settle around? What kind of rules lawyers questions would you ask to stall the Ossiarch Bone Reaper General? And I would love to read them. Thank you so much, and I will check you out in the next video. Happy wargaming, friends. Welcome, wargamers, to the Ballroom Blitz of the Mortal Realms, because today we are talking about Dawnbringers, The Mad King Rises, Book 4 of the Dawnbringers series, and Part 2 of this book's coverage here on the channel. Now, in our last video, we left on quite a cliffhanger. The Crusade in Guaran had split up a bit. Its leader, Marshal Thorian, the Dame of Leaves, met up with Astria Soulbright, who's on her own, vampire hunting side quest, and they came up with a plan to navigate the region of Guaran, known as the Neck. They were drawn into the view of a majestic castle that sits at the center of all these valleys, and the Crusade broke up in smaller groups to get around it. As our named heroes approached the doors to the castle, a most curious thing happened. They were greeted by honored guests of the castle. There were tons of ghouls that ran up to greet them, and one mysterious vampire figure, who had a long snake familiar coiled about her. Who this person is and what's going on is the subject of today's video as we continue to follow the Guaran side of the Great Twin-Tailed Crusade. So, our team is brought in to this beaten up castle, and the scene that's described in here is just awesome. It's the stuff of pure Warhammer. Imagine walking into the ruined Great Hall of a castle, but instead of long feasting tables, it's simply a straight line of gore, limbs, and corpses. Skin is hanging from the walls in a twisted vision of like heraldry flags. All of this meat is rotting, so the whole place smells putrid, and if you've ever gotten a big waft of decomposition, you know how awful that is. And noticeably, whatever is happening here is deeply affecting the troops. Right, remember we mentioned the last one, Astria is really taking note of what's happening to the human elements of her force that's with her, because she's kind of using them as a barometer to figure out what's actually happening. The humans here seem to know that they're in danger, right? No one looks comfy, but what their eyes literally see is shifting in both major and minor ways. For example, those flags flicker to skin. The table flickers into corpses. Screams kind of intermingle and dip into music and song. So it's a moment by moment that they feel like their minds are kind of being pulled into this delusion. The key to survival here, and for this next little part, is you keep your eyes pointed on the ground. Because as the guests all sit around the quote-unquote people table, in walks the man himself, Ushiran, Mortarch of Delusion. And I will be honest with you, I reread this section a few times. I do feel like they gave him a suitably grand entrance into the story. He's weird, he's snarling, you see him and he still has this beastly silhouette in the doorway. The cloak is just like raggedly hanging from him. It depicts his confused state. He talks about himself in the multiple first person and so on. It was great. And he presides over the dinner table and he just, again, continuously, warmly greets his guests. And he's asking them questions like they came over for a dinner party. Like, tell me, what's going on the other side of the neck? Are people still doing their funny things in silly ways? Like, he's just asking them all these fun questions about current events from kingdoms that no longer exist. And Astria, who's defended, her mind in an arcane way, she's not falling for any of this, but she indulges him. She's noting how weird it is, but she's playing along. And the conversation is just hilarious, because you have Ushiran who's like, "So tell me of ye travels, O weary wanderer, I long so for the news of the world abroad." And she's like, "Why don't you tell me about this big line of dead bodies, yo?" Like, their conversations are not on the same level, but she will answer his questions and pose them herself. And the chat is interesting, and it's here that I wanted to point out a little bit more about Astria Soulbright herself. Her mission in this particular instance that she was dispatched for is that she's looking for a mythical figure called the Somber Paladin. Think of the resources she's been able to find, the little bits of lore that she's uncovered, makes this character seem like a lord of death who somehow rejected Nagash in order to rule justly. And of course, Astria, being the person who hunts down vampires to learn more, all about like the magics of life and death, would be keenly interested in a Lord of Death who rejects Nagash, and so she's looking for him, hence she's here. Now when she mentions the name, the Somber Paladin, Ushiran becomes exceptionally distant. And there's this weird, there's a tonal shift in the imagery we get for here, and basically he becomes very dour and says, "Such was our title in ages long past." Like I said, he always uses the multiple self. Plural, I should say. And he looks super sad, and after a bit of contemplation, he turns to make an address. Basically, he gets up to give a speech. Now it's at this second that I want to pause our story. This is an important scene because it shows that even Ushiran, the epicenter of all this madness, can be reasoned with. His delusions are not inherently violent, even in his presence where they'd be strongest. Where Astria was expecting jeers and insults and a beast, she was respected and greeted and invited into discourse. So I like this scene because it matches the absolute horror of everything going around them with this uncanny civility. But the reason I wanted to pause here is because this is where the party starts. There's a sidebar in the book that covers the next part and offers some context. Basically, the vampire we met earlier, the Snake Lady, is an emissary of Neffara, the Mortarch of Blood, and her name is Sekra. Sekra's job is to keep Ushiran soothed and calm. These interlopers have begun to disrupt that peace by reminding him of his previous lives, his trauma, his titles, all this kinds of stuff. She wants them gone. She's watching Astria talk to Ushiran and is like, I don't like this. Next to her is the Honorable Gore, the smaller named character we got in the Flesh Eater Court update. And now he's looking at the same situation. He doesn't like these guests coming in and chatting up his boss. But he also really doesn't like this vampire lady at all, because he's really protective of Ushiran. He's the enforcer of Flesh Eater Court law, which forbids them from turning on these guests of the king. But they reasoned together that if the guests were to attack, the Flesh Eater Courts could do whatever they wanted. And so the two seem to be in cahoots. Let's just work together, let's get rid of these humans, and then whatever business as usual they had before, we can get back to. At this, Sekra casts a mind control power over the chief engineer of the Cities of Sigmar force, that one we talked about before, who cleverly came up with a way to beat the Ossiarch Bone Reaper walls. She pulls out her pistol, and she shoots and fires at Ushiran right as he gets ready to make his proclamation that we were talking about. That's why I paused it. He gets up to speak and address and be like, I want to return as the Somber Paladin, and immediately takes a bullet for it. So now, unpause. There's a gunshot. And what was once a mad but cool and collected soon turns to absolute insanity with murder and flaying. And there's really 3 stories from this moment that we need to follow. Okay, this, like I said, this breaks into utter carnage. We need to follow the vampires of New Lamia, meaning all the people working for Neffara, and thereby Sekra, the Stormcast of Astria Soulbright, and the mortal Dawnbringers. You can throw in a 4th for the Flesh Eater Court, really, if you want to. But that shot rings out, and the court, that whole room, goes into absolute chaos. Now, Sekra's watching, but immediately notices something is wrong, right? The whole plan was, me and these Flesh Eater Court guys, we're going to get rid of these interlopers, these humans that have come in. We'll get back to business as usual. But she notices that all of the New Lamian representatives, all the vampires that are part of the Soulblight Gravelord's army, if you will, are getting torn to shreds at double the rate that the Dawnbringers are. So she turns to Gormain to be like, what are you doing? Who has vanished, and she's immediately attacked by a Haunter Courtier. She does the math real quick and realizes this was a trap. The Flesh Eater Courts allowed these guests in. Gormain pretended to bend his rules to allow the Mortarch to be hurt, so the fracas would cover the Flesh Eater Courts, purging the vampires of their court. This is like a whole side quest that we haven't really gotten into, and if you watched my series on the Flesh Eater Courts, I mentioned it heavily there. Essentially, Neffara has a plan to steal Ushiran, the Mortarch of Madness, all of his blood, and spread it around to create a little undead magic crazy cells all across the Cities of Sigmar. She siphons little bits of his blood here or there, it's sold to opulent cities as king's blood, and it starts to seed insanity all across the realms. This emissary group, led by Sekra, was there to keep him chill while siphoning off his blood for that purpose. At some point, Ushiran caught on and staged this grand theatrical thing as an excuse to kill all the New Lamians. And so, in this weird way, the Dawnbringer Crusade in the book called Dawnbringers became nothing more than side characters of trapped machinations of vampire feuding. Which is kind of cool. I love that they were just wrong place, wrong time. Sekra tries to call out to her New Lamian brood. They run for the tunnels down below, but they're intercepted by Gormain and a bunch of courtiers. They fail to stop her. She escapes. They have all the kinds of contingency plans and stuff. Like I said, I'm going to do a full video on Sekra. She deserves it. Because her escape from this space is amazing, but it takes a bit to explain. But rest assured, she escapes and will be back. The point is, Ushiran has shuffled off the yoke, at least temporarily, of vampires siphoning his blood. At least without his consent. So that's Sekra and the new Lamians gone. The next story is the Stormcast Eternals under Astria Soulbright. Basically, when the shot was fired and she saw Ushiran run away in pain, Astria Soulbright decided to chase him. She wanted to know what his proclamation was about to be. Was this the somber paladin she's looking for? Does he know where that is? Whatever it was. You know, if there's still a reasonable person under there after all, we can work together. And really, as she cornered him and found him after he was injured, all she got was a dark chuckle. Ushiran at this point was cool, calm, and collected again. He acknowledged that the somber paladin was a mask he once wore, but he is a man of many masks. He basically announces what we've already discussed. This whole thing, you know, hey, I'm so sorry I had to use you guys. I just needed to get rid of the new Nomians, and you seemed like a really, you know, convenient way to do that. I'm sorry for whatever happened. And he points to a pile of moldy books in the corner and says, you came here for arcane knowledge. If you want it, take it. And as they do go to get the books, he goes absolutely ballistic. I guess maybe they didn't understand it was like a come take it if you can instead of like an actual invitation. But Ushiran goes mad. He hucks Astria's Dracoline like it's a fastball at them. He shreds them apart. He starts eating Soulbright before she can even zap all the way back to Azir. I mean, she does. It's not like she's consumed soul-wise, but still, it was vicious and fast. And lastly, the human elements that were left back in the Grand Hall when the Stormcast ditched them are still being led by Marshal Thorian. They've had some Stormcast Eternals of their own who immediately began acting as a rearguard for the mortals. And at this point, Thorian has ditched the cannons, the fusillades, anything that was with that particular party that would slow them down, and they're just bolting out of the hall, trying to get away from the worst of the fighting. Because remember, this party starts and immediately all the vampires start murdering each other. The engineer who fired the shot is dead, but everyone else is still trying to wrestle with what exactly is happening around them right now. As they're making their way towards the exit, they're all stopped by Guaran, who gives pretty much the exact same explanation that Astria got before her death, but Guaran's a little bit more, I'm going to say, honest about it. The Dawnbringers were used as a means to an end, to get rid of the leech-like new Lamians, and while the humans were used as a pawn in that game, meaning the engineer, they weren't responsible for it, and so the Guaran, being a just person within his own moral reasoning, says, you guys are going to go ahead unharmed. And the Guaran side of the Crusade, our main characters, leave immediately. Presumably they grab all their gear, and they're going to be meeting up with the rest of the Crusade on the other side of these cliffs. And that's really where the scene ends, and so let's take a step back and talk about why is this cool. First of all, there's a lot to cover here. I love the idea that all of these crazy AF people just fooled the ever so clever new Lamians. The dramatic scenes were a lot of fun. They invited some wonderful sidebar stories, like being dropped in the middle of this Mortarch drama was very intriguing for me. And I got into this book, you know, I knew that Neffara had plans, she's been using his blood, and I was curious to see how that was going to be depicted. Because I like the idea of him being an unwitting pawn, but I didn't want his character to be so divorced from reality that it's like he's incapable somehow. Or he's not doing fun things, he's just kind of being the recipient of punishment. Instead, we got insight into Ushiran as a Mortarch. He's still scheming, seemingly growing in reason and rationality as his mind comes back together from being inside of the prison that Nagash had him in. Or at least cobbled together enough thoughts from his various masks or mentalities that present as a cogent character. In that moment, he was a character who knew what he wanted, and I like that. Those moments of lucidity where it's like, we need to fix this problem, and he finds clever solutions for it that no one saw coming. I will say, it was kind of funny that all that actually happened to the Crusade and Guaran in this book was that they hit a roadblock and they split up. Some of them went to a bad dinner party, and the rest moved on. The book even very briefly touches on other parts of the Crusade here, and most of them had to fight off monsters and flora, but they generally fared well. Because I imagine only Thorian's crew is really relevant to the ruse of the Flesh Eater courts, and really only one crew reported making it to the other side unscathed, and they did so because they recalled drinking from a beautiful pond in the middle of the neck. Meaning, to those of us who know what's going on, while the Crusade itself didn't suffer a ton of losses here. They did lose their main engineer, a bunch of cannons, and many have been touched by the madness of the Flesh Eater courts, either by direct contact or by drinking some of his ichor that exists in the water. So this is a blow to their mentality, if not actually their ability to function as a crusade. Now I want to end this scene with a few, I'm going to call them post-movie credits here. Teasers and stuff like that I want to lay out. One is just a call-out. Corus Cole is in communion with his god of corn in Akshi, and an underling tells him that Hammerhand is seen nearby. Cole instructs him to set a pyre so big that it can be seen from Azir, and essentially he's trying to set a trap to lure Vanus in, and we know Vanus is sort of headed that way. The other cutscene is something real interesting. It follows the story of different Ossiarch Bone Reaper emissaries. One that was chasing down Thorian's remaining army. They are given full orders to halt, fall back to the nearest defensible perimeter, and secure it. What's important about this note is that it comes from the Mortarch himself. We're talking Kagos, and it is faction-wide. Everyone, universally, stop your advance and dig in. What this means is that he knows something is going on, but he doesn't explain what. The other side thing has to do with Manfred von Karstein. It's sort of Ossiarch Bone Reaper related. Basically, he pilfered one of Arcan the Black's scout crews of Ossiarch Bone Reapers just to steal stuff. Basically, while Arcan wasn't looking, he loots and steals stuff for fun and adventure, and I love it. And in doing so, he finds that Arcan's Bone Reapers found some weird green glowing rock, and as he interacts with it, he's attacked by a swarm of colossal rats. And friends, I was there when GW announced 4th edition. Manfred just pickpocketed a world of hurt by opening the wrong door to Scavendom. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Guaran side of the Great Crusade. How do you feel about the Dame of Leaves, Marshal Thorian? She's my fave. This whole scene was great. I felt like, even though they were the main character technically, I felt like we were pawns in a greater story between the Mortarchs of just different death factions, and that's really cool. It made it very interesting. Like I said, the sidebars were very helpful for this, for context, but it was cool. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll be hopping into the next video very soon. Happy wargaming. Welcome, Wargamers, to the spicy pilgrimages of the Mortal Realms. Today, we are talking about Dawnbringers, The Mad King Rises, Book 4 of the Dawnbringer series. I'm sorry, Book 4, I think, and Part 3 of its coverage here on the channel. I don't know, there's getting to be so many of them, getting all jumbled up in my head, especially as I work ahead now. If you want to understand where we are with the story, please go watch the previous videos in the Dawnbringers playlist. I have a link in the description down below. And as we discussed in my previous video, the Guaran side of the Crusade is not doing good, and so today we're going to focus on the Akshi side. So now is the time in all of these Dawnbringer books where we have to hit the pause button a little bit and pivot our perspective, right? Episode 2 ended with the Guaran Crusade making a brilliant escape from the Fleshier Court domain. Ushiran's back and in a mean way, but now we have to understand what's going on with the Akshi side, known as the Crusade of Fire. And they've had a heck of a journey themselves, right? They have suffered multiple defeats, reinforcements, losses, like they've had allies come and join them temporarily and then leave. And the major theme that they've been battling as well is this internal struggle between a form of religious zealotry that threatens to take the entire crusade apart. And to be honest with you, this story, because I was like, how are they going to just smooth right into this kind of like nasty mess that this crusade has gotten themselves into? It picks up in a way that was both unexpected and totally delightful. Rather than the Dawnbringer Crusade itself, our scene on this, section of the map opens up with Luca Vi. Now, if you don't know who that is, the Nightmare Queen is the named Vengorian Lord. She's the female Vengorian Lord that the Soulblight Grave Lords have. One where she's like the top half is a vampire, the bottom half is sort of like a dragon monster. And she's hanging upside down and sleeping, and is awoken by some kind of clatter in the distance. Now, this is a section that has a lot of sidebars, if I'm going to be honest with you. So to get the full context, I'm going to kind of nurse the scene along a little bit, because it's kind of awkward to read at first. But essentially the story here is that she's in this spot waiting for Lord Weirdrawn to arrive. That is another one of the dynasties of Soulblight Gravelords. He's the one who has like the big zombie dragon and the Crimson Keep. Basically, her vampire order and his are in a tizzy about Vi's, types of vampires, the Vangorian lords, being a bit more animalistic. And there was some incident where the two vampire houses collided and a bunch of the Vordry guys got struck down by the monsters who went a little feral. Basically, it's an accusation that Luca Vi's people are just wild and need to be put down. Which, if you know her story, is kind of like her internal, turmoil that she focuses on, is like, I am this monster, but also I'm not. The lords of the Crimson Keep challenged her to an honor duel, and this was the place, wherever the scene opened up at, that both parties predicted the Crimson Keep would appear. Now, we've talked about the Crimson Keep a bit. Basically, it's a castle that belongs to Lord Vordry, and it just kind of teleports seemingly at random across the realms. Its gates open, the Blood Knights go out, destroy everything, come back, and basically it's the idea of Nagash using Lord Vordry as his hit squad, but he doesn't have any freedom to enjoy that. So they're just hanging out waiting for each other, but all of that is a side story that, frankly, we don't really get to see at this point. Because while Luca Vi is waiting for the castle to appear, the Crusade of Fire crests over a nearby hill. And the sounds that awoke her were cannons. The Crusade itself had unexpectedly run along this vampire feud. A metalith of Aqua Guaranis had basically broken free of its rigging and was kind of drifting. These are the big floating rocks that they use for transportation and also as founts of water from Guaran. Basically, it just started drifting over the hill, and so all these people are scrambling over like, go get the thing! And as they cross the hill, they see, snap, we just walked into something real mean. Now it's at this point, Luca Vi has a decision to make. And so she leaps down and starts making her way through the cities of Sigmar units. And when I say through them, I mean, there are some really cool scenes here. There's some Stormcast mixed in as well, but they're putting up a good fight. But she just claws and tears them into nothingness. And it's this very odd encounter battle where nobody was expecting to fight each other until the Crimson Keep begins to manifest, at which point Luca looks down at what she's doing, looks over at the castle, and goes, well, this is small potatoes, and ducks out. Basically, she retreats in good order. She's taken a bunch of casualties with her as she goes. And on her way out, she decides to kind of spoil the fun of the Crusade. Again, she can't stay for the whole party, but I can do something. And she essentially poisons the water in one of the aqualiths, or the metaliths that have Aqua Guaranis pouring from it, that had drifted this way. So their main water source broke free of rigging, drifted towards the Soulblight Keep. Luca comes down, poisons it. And then she ducks out. She's like, I gotta go hang with Lord Vordry. And like I said, it's not just one of their water sources, it's the biggest one. And this encounter battle that has huge consequences is where we pick back up with the Akshi Crusade, having just survived contact with a Soulblight Gravelord's army. And we meet our heroes in sort of a council meeting of leadership where none other than Neeve Blacktalon is on trial. And the basic problem as the Crusade sees it is this. The metalith drifted off because these cultists keep taking the wheels off the wagons for their weird, zealous, spin the wheel turns, all this kind of stuff, religious nonsense. In the eyes of the military guards here. Neeve saw where the metalith was headed, and that monsters, like these giant, we would call them Vangorian lords, but from her perspective, monsters, were patrolling the outskirts of this defensive perimeter, and so she launched an assault on the Vangori, essentially in their own defense. She'll run up, they'll distract the vampire lords, humans can go, get all the metalith stuff, bring it back, and then we'll retreat in good order. That's kind of what she was hoping for. Unfortunately, she brought a lot more Cities of Sigmar units into the fight than was intended because it bogged down. They had trouble getting the metalith, pulled back to where it should be, so it took a lot longer than expected, and ultimately Luca poisoned the well. Partially over the rage that she was feeling of Neeve coming in and messing up her Vangorian lords. When I say poisoned, the well used to spit water, and now it just heaves out like blood. She put a curse on it or something. And the arguments, in defense and also against Neeve Blacktalon's intervention essentially boil over, and she just leaves. She says, you're on your own, and she storms out. Pun intended. So this is a situation where they just lost some of their best allies. Neeve is an incredibly powerful Stormcast to have on your side, because they needed to point the finger somewhere and point blame on to why the Crusade is falling apart, right? It's falling apart because you took the wheels off the wagon and your metalith drifted away, but it's much easier to blame Neeve for instigating this fight that got it poisoned. Which, to be honest, as someone who reads a lot of these books, I like this as a tension where it's a warrior making the decision that to them makes the most sense reasonably, and then you have sort of the normal people or the society or society leads, whether they're mortals or not, questioning that, but they have to work together in such a way, and then this just falls apart. And so our story begins with the Aqshy Crusade losing, a massive source of potable water as well as some incredible allies. And it's here that the Crusade just pauses for a bit. They honestly just kind of stop, and two camps form. Those dedicated to Pontifex Zenestra and the Cult of the Wheel, which, let's be honest, makes up an overwhelming majority of the Crusade at this point. And they're all being fueled by religious zealotry. Whatever she says goes. Of course, she has the best intentions. When she judges Neeve Blacktalon, we all should judge Neeve Blacktalon, kind of a thing. And the remainder that either want to, wait for Lord Vedra to arrive, as she promised she would. This is like way back in Book 1 when she ducked out. Or they want to go back to Hammerhall outright. Say the Crusade is over, let's just turn back. And this kind of sect, this camp, if you will, is formed up a lot of the old military guard. They're like, well, we have orders from Vedra. Like, it's not about their fear or anything like that. The Crusade isn't working. We've been broken into a million pieces. We should just go back and try again. Or they say we should wait because my captain, my Grand Marshal told me she was coming and I believe her. A minority, but a vocal minority amongst the Crusade. And sort of the leader of this team of people, this camp if you will, is a young officer named Thungus Smold, which is an awesome name. And he's just widely regarded as a good kid. And kid is emphasized because he is an exceptionally young graduate of officer school. He's an artillery commander, but he is the highest ranking non-in-the-pocket of Pontifex Zenestra military leader that they have. It was at that big trial where he spoke in the defense of Neeve Blacktalon. He's the one leading the military troops who probably got killed more than others, and he's saying, we needed to do this. There was, you know what I mean? Like, there was no other way, because if the Vangorian lords just got a hold of the metalith, we'd be in trouble anyway. So, like, Neeve stretching out to kind of at least attempt to distract them was helpful, even if it didn't pan out. It's not her fault. He's trying to be reasonable, but nobody wants to hear him. Because it was the main Guaranus metalith that they have, strict water rationings are put in place. And this only ratchets up the discontent because you are in, of course, the realm of fire. Everyone's mouth is dry. They're all burning up. Like, they just need water. And it leads up to one night, and my assumption is, based on this, that it happens in such a way that the camp, or the Crusade rather, stops for like a day or two to like figure out what they want to do. The trial happens there, and on maybe the second or third night, the sentries begin blaring their horns because they see lights on the horizon. So a bunch of the groggy men come out, they start, loading their guns, forming up lines, only to realize that the lights that they are seeing are moving away. And they realize to their cold horror that Smold is leading his men back to safety. Basically, the most professional military and logistic arm of the Aqshy Crusade said, we're done. Grand Marshal Vedra has told us that she's going to come, so we're either going to find a defensible position and wait for her, or we are going to return to Hammerhall Aqshy. They didn't tell anybody which they're going to do. So this is a plot thread that's being thrown out there, and I'm excited to see what happens to it. Now, it's important to note here that this is not a unanimous decision amongst people who are not believers in the Cult of the Wheel. For example, elves and Duarden that were not part of the cult stayed for their own reasons, as did some of the soldiers that saw themselves duty-bound, to Vedra to see this through. There's a bunch of different opinions and reasons on why we should go or stay, and you have to remember that even though we've gotten further and further from the origins of this grand crusade, it initially enraptured people because the idea is you get to go be a pioneer, and if you found the city, you get to secure your place in the nobility of it going forward. It's money. It's riches, it's glory, and for elves and Duarden that live so much longer than men, it only makes more sense, right? That reason only becomes grander. many of the Crusade that were still with the Pontifex. And I'm going to point that out. When I say Crusade from now on, I'm talking about just the religious cultists, largely. The military arm is gone. They don't come back this story. So, like, let's just put a pin in that. When I say Crusade of Fire, we're talking about Zenestra at this point. Many of her flock are freaking out because they just lost a bunch of guns and logistics and stuff. But Pontifex Zenestra sees this as a boon, a good thing. And the reason is, now the Crusade can be of one mind. And her quote that I love to death, is, "What were logistics compared to righteousness?" Right? We're going to see this through because we're righteous. We don't need them and all their plans and guns and armor. And she says, hey, everybody, on top of that, once the doubters and the non-believers left our camp, I had a vision. And we kind of get the sense that she's spinning this. She calls it a vision, but it seems, honestly, like it's just a lot of really good logic, like Sherlock Holmes style. And the vision is this, that somewhere nearby there must be a place of arcane power that we can go and channel that raw energy to purify our fount of Aqua Guaranus, and the Crusade is back to where it should be. Now, more unified than ever since we got rid of the doubters. Okay, so that's the vision that she tells people, but let me break down the logic that I think that she used to get there, okay, where it wasn't necessarily all that holy. She reckons that if Lucavai was here, and the Crimson Keep was appearing in the distance, the two must have been meeting, which makes perfect sense. And while no one really knows where the keep will be, it's not unreasonable to assume it would locate itself near places of great power. Again, all of these cities are being founded on spots of large geomantic power, and so maybe there's one nearby, and if so, we can use it as a power source to purify the fount, saving the day and solidifying my place as their religious leader, because, come on, show me a religious leader who would pass up the idea to give water where rivers ran with blood. Like, that's just such a picturesque miracle that it's like, of course she wants that. And that ends up being the plan for now. Find the source of power that likely drew the Crimson Keep in, and use it. Now, the environment that they're in is not super hospitable to scouting, but they do quite a bit and find, after a few days of just nasty climbing up sheer faces, they find a destroyed city, the remains of a place known once as Embergard. This is the place where it seems to be humming with all kinds of power. And so Pontifex Zenestra and her crew move into the city, and that is where we will pick back up in tomorrow's video. But like all of these, I want to end it by asking the question simply, why is this cool? I'll be honest, the Actu side has not been my favorite side of the Crusade, just because I feel like it's just a lot of the same note of Zenestra taking more control and more control. But I do feel like in this section of the story, I liked that they broadcast her telling people that she had a vision, while then also giving us the details on how she could have reached that conclusion on her own, because now we don't know which it is. I like those little things, where you can perceive this character as being genuine, the real article, and she certainly has performed huge acts of heroism and power and feats before, but there's also this like realpolitik thing where she's trying to solidify a power base. She wants their zealotry. She wants their unquestioned belief. She's not looking to sharpen, iron sharpens iron and we all get better together. She wants control. And it just makes for a good reading. I thought this story was much more interesting than, say, in the last book. I like it because it highlights the human element of the Crusade, right? The religious fervor was a theme in the Old World Empire, and I think they even had more units to really represent that, but this factionalism is interesting. And I like that at least one of the Crusade arms is dealing with it as a theme. I honestly would have thought the Guaran side would have been the place to talk about religious fervor, because I assumed that they were going to go the route of like, there's tension between Sigmar worshippers and Alariel worshippers, because on the Guaran side, Alariel is like literally there, IRL, doing a ritual to make rain wash away Nurgle stuff. That seems pretty deity-rific, if you will. But instead they focused on Akshi, where it wasn't about like choosing Alariel over Sigmar, it was just choosing Sigmar to the point of insanity. It's terrifying. And it's all breaking down in real time. But to the people caught within that crusade, they are caught in this logical loop, if you will. Maybe sunken cost fallacy might be better way to say it, but a cult mentality. Everything they do is a vindication of their faith. They do the things that they do, even if they question them, because they have faith. It's a circle. All things exist to prove that we are right, and any contradictions that strike us down simply make us martyrs. And to be honest, I think that's best exemplified with the Pontifex's quote, "What are logistics compared to righteousness?" And if you are at all, even like a passing student of history, we have many in real life atrocities that can answer that question. The answer is nothing good. When one army is cut off with no resupply, nothing good has ever happened from that situation. I don't know what you're talking about. More than a few folks have met their end because some overpaid, really high up people didn't think too hard about day 2 of a war or a battle or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, that's where logistics comes in. It's not just the initial showing of strength, but the foundational power of a force to take a punch and then deliver more. That's what logistics brings. Anyway, friends, I would love to hear your thoughts on the Crusade of Fire. I'm going to finish up The Mad King Rises, take a small 1 or 2 video break just to talk about Conquest and some other stuff that's been really exciting for me, and I'm going to jump back in with the Shadow of the Crone. None of that is before, however, I finish this. So next video is going to be the conclusion of the Akshi side of Crusade in Mad King Rises, and then, like I said, we'll move into some other exciting kinds of lore coverage. So thank you all so much. If there are any characters from this book that you want highlighted, I'm already going to do a video on Sekra, the snake vampire lady. I believe she was the only named character added in this specific set. But we'll move on from there. So thank you so much for watching and listening, and I can't wait to catch you in my next video. Happy wargaming! Welcome, Wargamers, to the last gasp of flames within the mortal realms, because today we are talking about Dawnbringers, The Mad King Rises, Book 4 of the Dawnbringers series, and this is part 4 of its coverage here on the channel. I'm going to jump right in. We left off with the Akshi Crusade yesterday, so if you want to get caught up or you don't know what we're talking about, the Dawnbringers is a campaign series that ends 3rd edition Age of Sigmar and leads us into 4th. It's the best time to pick up the story, so if you are interested in learning more about AOS, this is an invitation to grab your models and your paintbrushes, just throw on the playlist, and you'll be all caught up by the end. So let's not waste a moment of time, right? We were in the middle of something. We were following the Akshi Crusade of Fire when Pontifex Zenestra took full control. The Black Talons have been thrust out of the army, and Zealotry is now taking him over. The water well that they had was poisoned, but Zenestra thinks that finding a local place of power can help purify it. And this takes them nearby to the remains of a long ago failed city plant called the City of Embergard. Now let's talk about this place, because wow, like, what a bummer, okay? Essentially, almost 200 years ago, a city was planted here because it is the site of a great geomantic power, as all of these cities of Sigmar are built upon. Right, we're piecing this together. I don't know why it's not on anyone's maps, but okay. What those cities' founders had no way of knowing is that this location, amongst all the other ones, was one of great importance to the Lord of Undeath, Nagash. This is the site of an epic battle that he wants to commemorate. And so, to make it special, he did this little fun thing where the Crimson Keep would appear here every 107 years on the dot. And this is where we get that first idea that even though the Crimson Keep's, locations that it goes to seem random, there are some patterns that it hits with regularity. Typically those have to do with special memories of Nagash, where he's like, I just want to make sure this place where I had this one great memory stays, I don't know, deathy. So he'll throw the Crimson Keep there once every century or so. So this poor city is founded. Okay, they've had presumably some time to get built and set up, and then one day an entire vampire kingdom is just dropped upon them, right? They had no way of knowing that this was the site, so the Crimson Keep just unleashes hell upon the poor city of Anvilgard, which is annihilated and only ruins remain. That was some time ago. In our story today, the Crimson Keep just left. Remember when the Akshi side of the Crusade had just started? Lukovi had seen him, the Crimson Keep rather, with Lord Vordry, and then bolted off. That was more than a day ago. It only stays around for the night, and so essentially Pontifex Zenestra is like,
Well, okay, it's gone, but the place of power might still be there, and we can use that power. It also means that, should they choose to found their new city here, in 107 years, the Crimson Keep will come and unleash hell. What's left behind here is mostly devastation. But anyway, my point being that, like, Zenestra could not have known that. They just stumbled into this ruined city that they're like, how come there's no maps to this place? There's no information about it. And we, as, you know, with a greater perspective as we read, understand this place is just a massacre site, and staying here is just not a good idea. As the Crusade starts to filter in, there's a few buildings standing. I mean, they're all kind of falling apart, but there's a few things. And as they start to open the doors and see, you know, what's here that they can use, look for this weird place of power, the undead of Embergard, stuck in this weird state of undeath for over a century, descend upon the Crusade as they make their way into the city. Now, I imagine the story didn't spend a lot of time on this section, but I like to imagine like you're walking through these creepy corridors of like dense buildings, a lot of it's ash and rubble, but then, I don't know, just from every direction, things stand up and start moving towards you. I get the idea that it was very creepy. And there's even like a Geist who stands up, pops up, and essentially explains the situation to the Pontifex and says, this is no place for the living. We used to be the citizens of Embergard, and we thought it was a place for the living, but we were dumb. And then we got killed for it, and you're going to get killed for it. Time to join Nagash. So even though the Crimson Keep is gone, the death magics and the necromancy that was put in place here to kind of keep it a quote-unquote holy site are still defending it. At this point, a battle ensues, essentially between a Soulblight Gravelord's army led by a necromancer that was left behind and the Crusade itself. There's Geists, several Coven thrones are described, skeletons all over the place, and zombies. And the strategy for the Dawnbringers was, I'm going to say, far from subtle, okay? They are way too tired for that. No one's had enough water. They're kind of losing their minds. They just decide to surge forward. War priests are exulting, flagellants and ahead of them, and basically the undead goal is simple: entrap and kill them, while the living just want to destroy everything. And as these two forces just madly run at each other, because again, the ghosts are not putting up a whole bunch of complex tactics, if you will, Pontifex Zenestra sees another way to achieve her goals. She's basically looking around this battlefield, she's probably the most secure person on it, and looking across the city to look for where could this site of power be, because if I can find that, not only can I fix the fountain that we're here for, but maybe I could use that as a weapon as well. She sees the remains of essentially a giant temple that made its home on the side of the city, and she points to it and basically says, take me to that thing, and all of her little posse, her most vigilant entourage, starts barreling towards this. Wherever they're headed towards, it has natural power that's really popping, and Zenestra wants it. And so, if you were to look at this from like an aerial view, I imagine there's a big battle enveloping, dead forces, while the Dawners are pushing out from the sides, and then there's just one line of heroes that's just piercing through the madness, trying to make its way to this temple. Once the Pontifex reaches it, she essentially goes Super Saiyan. We've seen this a few times with the Pontifex, where she gets an influx of power and immediately just discharges it to annihilate everything around them. She did it with Trug, at least was able to scorch his skin, which nobody else could do. And this ends up being a stand or die moment for the Crusade. So they reach the temple, the Pontifex says, go get me the ashes of martyrs, and her followers go get these big jugs that are full of literally the ashes of people who have died on this crusade. She makes a giant ring of spell casting around her little palanquin, her little loft thing that she rides on. And it seems to be that the ashes of these martyrs almost act as part of her ritual like a conduit. She essentially becomes a lightning rod for this geomantic power that's underneath the earth, the one that they were looking for, essentially. And she conducts for herself a big spell. Like we've seen sometimes before, a beam of holy light shoots directly from her into the sky in a perfect line. What's important to note is, first off, this beam of light shoots the necromancer that's leading all these things out of the sky. And then lightning arcs off of this beam and begins basically shooting the other Coven thrones out of the sky. At the same time as this is happening, the blood coming from the metallith begins to cough and returns to water. Whatever ritual she was trying to do apparently was very quick to complete, or maybe the ashes of the martyrs just sped it along. I don't quite know. They were very vague about how those things fit into her ritual. But essentially she made herself the conduit of all this power, knocked out the necromancer, which then of course had a cascading effect on the undead army around it, and she collapses into her throne. People are worried about the Pontifex, but honestly her job is done because without the undead loci of the necromancer, this Soulblight army just kind of begins to fall apart, some of them quite literally. And with this, the cities of Sigmar take another win from the jaws of defeat. And it's a two-pronged win, right? The undead are gone, and now they're in a defensible place to rest, but also they have water. And so it's this big reprieve where they can actually recharge a bit and maybe kind of reorganize, redo whatever they need to do, re-equip, rearm before their next stretch. The problem is, this only serves to deepen the devotion of anyone on the Crusade who was kind of on the fence, right? She turned blood into water with the power of prayer and faith. That's a hard one to pass on if you see it happen. And I'll be the first to say that I was actually surprised that this is where the story ends for the Dawnbringers of Aqshy. Essentially, when I take these notes, I do the notes as I read them. I'll read ahead of the story once, go back, and then I'll take the notes as I go. And it was a bit jarring of how hard of a stop it was with this story. Essentially, she had contact with two different Soulblight Gravelords army, right? The Vangori and then the Necromancers. And it just seems like they're going deeper and deeper into a spiral of belief and self-fulfilling prophecy that's going to take them to ruin. Regardless, having, defeated an undead army and now secure with water at the rubbling site of Embergard for them to launch the next stretch of their expedition is pretty much where the scene fades to black on the part of Pontifex Zenestra. But as with all my videos, before we close out, let's talk about why is this cool. I've always said that zealotry is one of my favorite themes in books, and that's still true. If there is a faction that has a sub-faction that tends to have religious zealots, I like that one. I don't know why. But my problem is, with this specific series, is that I need that zealotry to go somewhere. And I feel like the last two books for the Aqshy side have been, and then they got more zealous. And that's basically all it's been. They add some allies, they lose them very quickly, book to book. And it's the little things like questioning if Pontifex Zenestra is having a vision or just really good at, reading the tea leaves, so to speak. It just is interesting, but that's not brought up enough to justify how long we've been sitting with, and they moved a little bit further forward and got more zealous. I feel like that's kind of what it's been. Now, we do see, I will admit, in this book in particular, a lot more hints that their zealotry is affecting their ability to function. For example, the whole reason the Metalith went loose in the beginning is because they keep taking all the wheels for their cult services and stuff like that as icons. There are now entire routes through mountain passes that are unavailable to them because they have no carts. So at this point, the safer choice is now not an option because of the decisions that they're making. They have less and less military cohesion on the battlefield because the zealots are acting like you'd expect zealots to act. You just run forward and start mauling things while you pray. And kind of stepping back to wrap a bit of a bow on the book itself, I do feel like there was a lot more intrigue on the Guaran side. In fact, after this climactic battle in Aqshy, there's a cutscene between, essentially an avatar of Neffara and Ushiran, where he declares that he will be taking over the distribution of King's Blood, and that maybe he'll insert himself into more current affairs than he has been. Meaning, even the book ends by saying, this is really about, Ushiran, which totally is, to be fair, right? The thing is called The Mad King Rises. But to be honest, if you're going to go that far, I kind of would have preferred a book that was all about the Guaran side, and then maybe the next book be all about the Aqshy side, or something like that. As is, there are some really cool fight scenes in the Aqshy side of the story. The banishing of Neeve was a really cool scene. But it just didn't move the story forward significantly. Now, if you've read the Black Talon books and you already know how much she struggles with being separate from humanity and being regarded as this other, you know that this must have been an incredibly emotional scene for her as a character. Essentially, if you haven't read those books, She, after so many reforgings, has been kind of gaining abilities. She can kind of like move through the ether almost like Griff Chargers can or something like that. She's got all kinds of abilities, and she listens to the other Stormcast talk about the wrongness of how, you know, some immortals, when they've been reforged too many times, like Vanus, he's prophetic, and it's kind of a power that people aren't sure if they trust. She does not trust herself. So when you have a whole room of people decrying her as, you know, a war hawk and a monster that got a bunch of people killed, you can easily see that being a very deep moment for her personally. But what did you think? I'll be honest with you, I'm still excited for the rest of the series. I know what the next book holds for the Akshi side of the Crusade, so I have lost no steam. I know it gets interesting, it gets fun. I'm excited to take you there. This book did not represent how fun the Akshi side of the Crusade could be, in my opinion. But I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments down below. I will catch you next time in my next video covering the Shadow of the Crone, as we continue the Dawnbringers campaign series on the march to 4th edition. Let me know what you're excited about, what you want to see, and I'll chat with you next time. Happy wargaming, friends.